Story: a chilling encounter with a knife-wielding stranger. You always think you'll know what to do if something terrible happens. Run, scream, fight back. At least, that's what I told myself. But when you're faced with the unthinkable, the reality is far more paralyzing than you can imagine. It started like so many other nights, scrolling through my phone, searching for connection in the vast sea of social apps. As an autistic teenager, making friends in person wasn't easy. Online, I could be myself without the fear of misreading someone's tone or expression. That's where I met Leo. He was funny, kind, and easy to talk to. He told me he understood what it felt like to be different, to feel isolated and unseen. For weeks, we chatted every day, sharing secrets and jokes, building what felt like a real connection. So, when he suggested we meet in person, I didn't hesitate. That night, standing under the dim glow of the streetlights, I never expected my world to shift in an instant. I didn't expect to feel the cold steel of a knife pressed against my neck or hear the words that would haunt me for years to come. What would you do if a friend suddenly became your worst nightmare? It's strange how quickly someone can feel like a part of your life. When I first started chatting with Leo, I wasn't looking for anything serious, just someone to talk to. But he had this way of making you feel seen, like every word you said mattered. He was different from the others I'd talked to online. He didn't just ask what my favorite movies were or what music I liked. He asked real questions. What makes you happy? What's the scariest thing you've ever been through? I told him about my struggles with making friends, how I often felt like I was on the outside looking in. He shared his own stories of feeling out of place, of growing up in a house where silence was more common than laughter. I think people like us are drawn to each other, he said once. We see the cracks in each other's armor. It felt true. I'd never met someone who understood me so completely. When he suggested meeting up, I was nervous but excited. Just a chill hangout, he said. No pressure. I told myself it was safe. After all, we'd talked for weeks. He wasn't a stranger. The night was colder than I expected. I stood on the curb outside my house, shifting from foot to foot as I waited. The streets were quiet, the kind of peaceful stillness that makes you feel like you're the only person in the world. When Leo appeared, I almost didn't recognize him at first. He looked just like his photos, a little taller than I imagined, with shaggy dark hair and a hoodie that hung loosely on his frame. He smiled as he approached, and I felt my nerves ease slightly. "Hey," he said, handing me a bottle. It was a wine cooler. I wasn't much of a drinker, but I took it anyway, not wanting to seem rude. We sat on the curb, passing the bottle back and forth as we talked. The conversation flowed easily, just like it had online. He told me about his favorite bands, the places he wanted to travel, and the things he wished he could change about his life. For a while, it felt like I'd made a real friend. But then, something shifted. It started subtly. Leo's laughter became less frequent, his responses more clipped. He began glancing over his shoulder, his eyes darting to the shadows like he was expecting someone or something to emerge. "You okay?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood up, brushing the dust off his jeans. "You ever feel like everything's pointless?" he asked suddenly, his voice low. The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" "Like, no matter what you do, it doesn't matter. People don't care. They don't see you." "I see you," I said, hoping to comfort him. He turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Do you?" Before I could respond, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a knife. The blade gleamed under the dim light, its sharp edge catching my breath in my throat. "Don't move," he said quietly, his voice calm but laced with something darker. I froze, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it might drown out his words. "Leo," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. "What are you doing?" He moved closer, the blade now inches from my neck. "You don't get it," he said. "You don't know what it's like to feel this hollow." My mind raced. Was this a joke? A test? But the cold steel against my skin was all too real. "You don't have to do this," I said, my voice trembling. "We can talk. Whatever's wrong, we can figure it out." His grip on the knife tightened, Talking doesn't fix anything. People like us, we're just broken. I don't know where I found the courage, but somehow, I managed to speak. I see your scars, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. His eyes narrowed. What? I see them. I repeated. You're hurting. Leo, I know what that's like. But this won't make it go away. It'll just make it worse. He hesitated, the knife trembling in his hand. I have scars too, I continued, lifting my sleeve slightly to reveal the faint lines on my wrist. I get it. I really do. But you don't have to do this. You're not alone. For a long moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, slowly, he lowered the knife. I don't want to be like this, he said, his voice breaking. You don't have to be, I replied. But this isn't the way. He stepped back, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of the world had finally crushed him. Go, he muttered, not meeting my eyes. I didn't need to be told twice. I walked away, my legs trembling with every step. I didn't dare run, afraid that any sudden movement might set him off again. When I reached my front door, I turned to look back. He was gone, swallowed by the shadows of the night. Inside, I locked every door and window, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the key. The next morning, the reality of what had happened hit me like a tidal wave. My neck still felt the phantom weight of the knife, and my mind replayed the encounter on an endless loop. I blocked Leo on every platform, deleted the app, and vowed never to meet anyone online again. But even with those precautions, the fear lingered. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every stranger a potential danger. I jumped at loud noises, avoided going out alone, and flinched whenever someone got too close. It wasn't just fear, it was a deep, bone-deep mistrust of the world around me. Years have passed since that night, but the memory remains as vivid as ever. I often wonder what would have happened if I hadn't spoken up. If I hadn't found the right words to reach him, would I have become just another tragic headline? I still think about Leo sometimes. Was he truly dangerous? Or just a broken soul crying out for help? Did he ever get the support he needed? Or did he disappear into the shadows, taking his pain with him? I'll never know. But one thing is certain. That night changed me forever. It taught me the fragility of trust, the power of empathy, and the importance of listening to your instincts. What would you have done in my place? Story: a dangerous group encounter. It's funny how a simple craving can lead you into the jaws of danger. That night, I wasn't thinking about risk or vulnerability. I just wanted a snack. The clock had slipped past 3 a.m., and my small apartment felt unbearably quiet. My roommates were all out for the weekend, and the absence of their usual chatter left the air feeling hollow. I'd spent the night gaming with friends online, laughing and bantering as we pushed through hours of competition. But when the session ended, an emptiness crept in, the kind of void you try to fill with anything. For me, it was hunger. The nearby corner store had always been my go-to for these late-night cravings. It was small, a little rundown, and frequented by the kind of people who didn't ask questions. But it was open, and that was all I needed. I grabbed my coat and keys, rolling a joint before heading out. The night air bit at my skin as I stepped outside, the streets eerily quiet. Normally, I found a strange comfort in the solitude of these walks. The world felt like it was mine alone, just me and the hum of distant streetlights. But something about that night was different. The corner store's neon sign glowed faintly ahead, its flickering light a beacon in the otherwise dark street. As I approached, I noticed a group of men lingering near the intersection. There were 4 of them, their figures half obscured by the shadows. At first glance, they looked like any group of late-night smokers, chatting idly as they passed around cigarettes. But something about their presence felt off. Maybe it was the way they glanced at me, too long, too intent, or the way their conversation seemed to hush as I neared. My gut tightened. I told myself I was being paranoid, letting the late hour and dim lighting get to me. Still, my pace quickened, and I focused on the store's door, just a few steps away. I was almost past them when one of them spoke. "Hey," he called out, his voice sharp enough to freeze me mid-step. I turned, my stomach nodding as the man stepped forward. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a cocky smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Routine ID check," he said, holding up his hand as if flashing a badge. "Show us your identification." My heart sank. The words didn't make sense. Routine ID check? At 3 a.m.? My mind raced, trying to reconcile what I was hearing with what I was seeing. The man stepped closer, his grin widening. "You know, smoking in public is illegal, right?" he added, gesturing toward the joint tucked behind my ear. I stammered, caught off guard. I didn't know that." He chuckled, his friends closing in around me. They didn't wear uniforms, and none of them had shown any identification. Still, the way they moved, the practiced confidence in their voices, it was clear they were used to intimidating people. "Let's make this easy," the man continued, his tone light but dangerous. "Show us your ID and empty your pockets. Standard procedure." My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like lead. I glanced around, searching for someone, anyone who might intervene. The street was empty, the store's cashier visible but oblivious inside. "Come on," the man said, his patience thinning. "We don't have all night." I fumbled in my pocket, pulling out a crumpled €5 bill and a battered pack of gum. "This is all I have," I said, my voice trembling. The man's expression darkened. "No wallet? No ID? That's suspicious, don't you think?" The tension was suffocating. They weren't going to let me go. I could see it in their eyes, the gleam of predatory delight, the way they fed off my fear. The leader's smirk returned as he leaned closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "What else you got? Huh, don't make me check for myself." I knew I had to think fast. The store was just across the street, but the men were blocking my path. If I ran, they could catch me, or worse. And then, a desperate idea flickered in my mind. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stand taller. When I spoke, my words came out thick with a deliberate Russian accent. "My friends," I said, pausing to make it sound uncertain. "They have my wallet. We meet here. They come soon." The men froze, their confidence faltering. The leader narrowed his eyes, studying me. "Your friends?" he repeated. "Yes," I said, nodding toward the store. "Big men. You wait. They come." The air grew heavy with tension. The men exchanged glances, their bravado cracking under the weight of my words. In my neighborhood, Russian gangs had a reputation for being brutal and unforgiving. If these men thought I was connected to them, it might be enough to scare them off. The leader hesitated, his sneer faltering. "All right," he said finally, his voice less certain, "but get us something to drink. Now." Relief flooded through me, though I kept my expression neutral. I nodded, turning toward the store with deliberate slowness. The moment I stepped inside the store, the fluorescent lights felt like a lifeline. My hands were shaking as I grabbed a six-pack of sodas, my mind racing with what to do next. The cashier, an older man with tired eyes, watched me carefully. "You okay?" he asked quietly. I hesitated, my fear warring with my instinct to keep quiet. Finally, I whispered, "There's a group outside. They're waiting for me." His expression hardened. "Stay here," he said firmly. He moved to the door, locking it with a sharp click before flipping the sign to closed. Together, we watched as the men lingered outside, their frustration growing with each passing minute. Eventually, they gave up, muttering curses as they disappeared into the shadows. I stayed in the store for what felt like hours, my heart still pounding in my chest. The cashier handed me a cup of water, his presence a quiet comfort. "You're lucky," he said after a while. "People like that, they don't usually let you go so easy." The weight of his words sank in slowly. I had been lucky. If the bluff hadn't worked, if they'd seen through my act, I didn't want to think about what might have happened. When I finally stepped outside, the streets were empty. The walk back to my apartment was a blur, every sound and shadow setting my nerves on edge. That night left a mark on me, one that hasn't faded even after all these years. I still think about the leader's grin, the way his tone shifted from playful to menacing in an instant. I think about the split-second decision to lie, the sheer desperation that fueled the bluff. Could I have handled it differently? Should I have screamed, fought, Run? I'll never know. What I do know is this: the world isn't as safe as we'd like to believe. A late night walk, a craving for snacks, it's all it takes to find yourself in the wrong place at the wrong time. If you'd been in my shoes, what would you have done? Would you have thought fast enough to bluff? Or would fear have taken over? Even now, I'm more cautious. I avoid walking alone at night, keep my phone within reach, and stay hyper-aware of my surroundings. That night taught me a lesson I'll never forget. Sometimes, survival depends on quick thinking and a bit of luck. Story: high school crush turned nightmare. In high school, Marco was the kind of boy who seemed larger than life. He wasn't just popular, he was magnetic. The captain of the basketball team, with a sharp wit and a smile that could disarm anyone. Marco had a way of making every room he entered feel like it was revolving around him. I wasn't part of the popular crowd. I wasn't quirky enough to stand out, nor quiet enough to fade into the background. I existed in that strange in-between, where people knew your name but rarely remembered you after the yearbook was signed. Despite this, I'd harbored a quiet crush on Marco for as long as I could remember. I told myself it was harmless, just a silly infatuation that would fade. But every time I saw him, laughing with his friends or shooting hoops after school, my heart would flutter just a little too much. So when he approached me during a Friday night football game, I thought I'd misheard him. "Hey," he said, leaning casually against the bleachers. His voice was warm, his eyes bright with confidence. "You doing anything later?" The world around me seemed to blur. No, not really," I stammered. "Cool," he replied, as though we were old friends. "Let's hang out. Meet me at the entrance at halftime?" I nodded, unable to form words. As he walked away, I felt the stares of the other girls nearby, their envy palpable. For once, I wasn't invisible. At halftime, Marco was waiting for me by the gates. His car, sleek and polished, glinted under the stadium lights. I slid into the passenger seat, nervous but exhilarated. "You good?" he asked, glancing at me with a grin. "Yeah," I replied, though my hands fidgeted in my lap. He turned up the music, a mix of upbeat pop and smooth R&B, and we drove through the quiet streets of our town. The golden glow of streetlights streaked across the windshield, and for the first time in years, I felt noticed, special. We stopped at McDonald's, a random yet oddly comforting choice. Over burgers and fries, we talked about school, basketball, and music. He told me about his younger sister, Sophia, and how much trouble she gave him. "She's wild," he said, shaking his head with a chuckle, "always getting into things she shouldn't." I laughed, feeling like we were connecting. For a moment, it felt like the start of a teenage love story, the kind I'd always daydreamed about. Then, the night shifted. As we left the parking lot, Marco's demeanor grew more serious. He drove in silence for a while, his usual ease replaced with something heavier. I thought maybe I'd said something wrong, but before I could ask, he pulled into a dimly lit side street and parked. "Hey," he said, turning to me. His voice was steady but firm. "I need your help with something." "Sure," I replied, though my stomach tightened at the sudden shift in tone. He reached over, opened the glove compartment, and pulled out a gun. My breath caught in my throat. It was heavier and more menacing than anything I'd ever seen in real life. The metal gleamed faintly in the dim light, and the air in the car seemed to thicken. "Can you get rid of this for me?" he asked, his words calm but loaded with unspoken urgency. I stared at him, my mind racing. What do you mean?" "It's nothing big," he said, brushing it off like he was asking me to throw away an old soda can. "Just get rid of it. Somewhere no one will find it. You'll be doing me a huge favor." I wanted to say no, to demand answers, to run. But the way he looked at me, expecting compliance, yet daring me to refuse, left me frozen. "Marco, I don't think I can." "You can," he interrupted, his tone firm but not aggressive. "Trust me, it's better this way." He wrapped the gun in a cloth and handed it to me, his expression unreadable. My hands shook as I took it, the cold metal seeping through the fabric like ice. "I'll drop you at your car," he said, his tone casual again. "Just let me know when it's done." The rest of the ride was suffocatingly silent. My thoughts swirled with panic and confusion. Why did he have a gun? What had it been used for? And why me? When he pulled into the school parking lot, he gave me a small smile. "You're awesome," he said, as if this were some trivial favor. I nodded numbly, clutching the wrapped gun like it was a live grenade. As his taillights disappeared, I sat alone in my car, the weight of what I was holding pressing down on me. Driving home felt like a fever dream. My mind raced with possibilities. Could I go to the police? What would they think of me? What if Marco found out? By the time I reached my driveway, my hands were trembling so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. My parents were asleep, their bedroom light off. I stared at the house, the gun burning a metaphorical hole in my passenger seat. I couldn't bring it inside. I couldn't keep it. Then I thought of the junkyard. My dad owned a scrapyard on the outskirts of town, complete with an industrial shredder. It was the kind of machine that could turn anything into unrecognizable scraps. I grabbed the gun and drove there, my heart pounding. The lot was dark and silent, the faint hum of machinery lingering in the air. I unlocked the gate, the metal creaking loudly in the stillness. The shredder loomed in the center of the lot, its steel blades gleaming under the moonlight. I stood there, the gun in my hands, my breath visible in the cold night air. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me, but I couldn't go through with it. Instead of using the shredder, I wrapped the gun in a McDonald's bag and drove to a park on the other side of town. The playground was deserted, the swings swaying slightly in the breeze. I approached a trash can near the edge of the lot, every shadow and rustle of leaves making my heart race. My hands shook as I dropped the bag inside, the sound of it hitting the bottom louder than it should have been. I didn't look back as I walked to my car, my pulse thundering in my ears. For the next few days, I lived in constant fear. Every siren made me jump. Every knock on the door felt like the police coming to arrest me. Then, the news broke. Marco's sister, Sophia, had been arrested for her role in a violent robbery. The details were horrifying. She had used a gun to threaten a store owner and, when he refused to comply, had beaten him with it. No one had been killed, but the victim was hospitalized with severe injuries. I couldn't breathe as I watched the report. Was it the same gun? Had I just disposed of evidence in a violent crime? Marco, meanwhile, acted as if nothing had happened. He laughed with his friends in the hallways, played basketball like always, and never mentioned that night. But every time I saw him, my chest tightened with a mix of fear and anger. Years later, the memory of that night still lingers. I think about how easily I was manipulated, how quickly a simple crush turned into something far more sinister. What haunts me most is the uncertainty. Did I do the right thing? Could I have stopped something worse from happening? Or did I make it all worse? I don't have the answers, but I know this: trust is fragile. And sometimes the people we admire the most are the ones who can hurt us in ways we never expect. What would you have done? Story: Motel Terror. Motels are supposed to be a temporary refuge, a place where you can catch a few hours of sleep before hitting the road again. That's what I told myself when I pulled into the small, dimly lit establishment on the outskirts of a forgotten desert town. The parking lot was nearly empty, the neon vacancy sign buzzing faintly in the otherwise oppressive silence. I didn't think twice about the isolated location or the peeling paint on the walls. After all, I was exhausted, and it was the only option for miles. What I didn't realize was that this would be the night I truly understood the meaning of fear. At 3 a.m., I woke to a faint scraping sound at my door. Groggy and disoriented, I assumed it was just the wind. But then I heard the metallic click of the door handle being tested. Heart pounding, I froze in my bed, straining to hear through the darkness. The handle jiggled again, harder this time. Someone was trying to get in. What would you do if you woke up to find yourself trapped, alone, and someone was just outside, trying to break in? The day had started early, with the rising sun stretching across the endless highway. I'd been on a solo road trip for a week, and the novelty of the open road was beginning to wear off. I was somewhere in the middle of the desert, miles from anything that resembled civilization. The landscape stretched out in every direction, a monotony of sand, rocks, and dry shrubs. By the time dusk began to settle, I was beyond tired. The prospect of driving another hour to the next major city felt impossible. That's when I spotted the motel. It sat alone, a single-story building with a row of rooms facing the parking lot. The sign read Sunset Haven, though it looked more like a place where travelers went to disappear. Still, I was too exhausted to care. I pulled into the lot, parked near the end, and checked in at the front desk. The clerk barely looked up as he slid the key across the counter. "Room 12, he mumbled. "Checkout's at 10. The room was exactly what you'd expect from a rundown motel. Stained carpet, outdated furniture, and a lingering smell of mildew. But it had a bed, and that was all I needed. I double-checked the locks before settling in, bolting the door and sliding the chain into place. The air conditioner hummed loudly, masking the eerie silence outside. Despite my exhaustion, sleep didn't come easily. I tossed and turned, the unfamiliar surroundings making it hard to relax. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind outside made my ears perk up. Eventually, I drifted off, lulled by the monotonous drone of the AC. But then, at some point in the night, I woke with a start. At first, I wasn't sure what had pulled me from my sleep. The room was pitch black, the only light coming from the faint glow of the neon sign outside. I lay there, listening intently, and then I heard it, a soft, scraping sound. The sound was faint but unmistakable, like metal against metal. It was coming from the door. I sat up slowly, my heart beginning to race. The scraping continued, followed by a soft click, as if someone was testing the lock. Maybe it's just the wind, I thought, though I didn't believe it. The handle jiggled once, then twice, harder each time. Someone was out there. Panic surged through me as I scanned the room for something, anything, I could use to defend myself. My suitcase sat in the corner, but it might as well have been miles away. The door rattled again, and I realized with a sinking feeling that the lock wasn't holding as firmly as it should. I slipped out of bed as quietly as possible, my bare feet pressing against the cold floor, keeping my breathing shallow. I moved toward the door, careful not to make a sound. From the small gap beneath the door, I saw shadows shifting. Whoever was out there wasn't giving up. I leaned closer, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. That's when I noticed something horrifying. The lock had been tampered with. The metal around the deadbolt was scratched and bent, as if someone had used a tool to pry it open. My mind raced. How had I not noticed this when I checked in? Had someone done this before I arrived? Or had they been watching me, waiting for the right moment? The handle jiggled again, more violently this time, and I knew I didn't have much time. I backed away from the door, my pulse pounding in my ears. I needed to get out, but the idea of stepping outside was just as terrifying as staying inside. My car keys sat on the nightstand, and I grabbed them with shaking hands. The car was parked right outside. If I could make it there, I'd be safe. I moved to the window, carefully pulling the curtain back just enough to see. The parking lot was deserted, save for my car and a few others scattered across the lot. But the shadows near the door didn't move, and I couldn't see the face of the person trying to get in. The door rattled again, harder this time. The chain groaned against the force, and I knew it wouldn't hold for long. With no time to waste, I made my decision. I slipped on my shoes, clutching my keys tightly, and moved toward the door. I waited for the next loud rattle before sliding the chain free and yanking the door open. The sudden motion startled the intruder, a tall man with wild eyes and a makeshift tool in his hand. For a split second, we locked eyes. His expression shifted from shock to anger, and I knew he wasn't going to let me go without a fight. I didn't wait for him to recover. I shoved past him, nearly tripping as I sprinted toward my car. Behind me, I heard him curse, his footsteps pounding against the pavement. My hands fumbled with the keys as I reached the driver's side door. My heart sank as I heard his footsteps getting closer, but somehow, I managed to unlock the door and dive inside. I slammed the door shut, locking it just as he reached the car. The man banged on the window, his face twisted in rage. His fist slammed against the glass, but it held firm. I turned the key, the engine roaring to life, throwing the car into reverse. I backed out of the parking space, narrowly avoiding the man as he lunged for the door handle. He stumbled, and I hit the gas, speeding out of the lot and onto the empty highway. My hands shook so badly I could barely grip the wheel, but I didn't slow down. In the rearview mirror, the motel faded into the distance, its neon sign flickering like a ghostly reminder of how close I'd come to danger. I didn't stop driving until I reached a gas station an hour away. There, under the harsh fluorescent lights, I finally allowed myself to breathe. The attendant gave me a concerned look as I stood by the counter, still trembling. I considered calling the police but hesitated. What could I tell them? That a man tried to break into my motel room? That the lock had already been tampered with when I checked in? I left the gas station without making the call, too shaken to relive the experience. For weeks after, I couldn't stop thinking about that night. The image of the man's face, the sound of the door handle jiggling, the way the lock had already been damaged, it all haunted me. Motels are supposed to be a safe place, a temporary home for weary travelers. But that night taught me how vulnerable we can be in unfamiliar places. I still wonder what the man's intentions were. Was he looking to rob me, hurt me, or worse? I'll never know, and maybe that's for the best. What would you have done in my place? Could you have stayed calm, or would panic have taken over? Story: the cabin watcher. The forest was denser than any of them had expected. As Sam drove the group through winding roads, the tall trees seemed to close in, their canopies weaving together to block out most of the afternoon sunlight. Claire, seated in the passenger seat, stared at the GPS on her phone, squinting as it struggled to maintain a signal. "This can't be right," she muttered. "It's right," Tara said from the back seat, an edge of defensiveness in her voice. The listing said it was secluded. That's the whole point. Max, sitting next to Tara, smirked. Secluded is one thing. This feels like the start of a bad horror movie. Relax, Tara shot back, rolling her eyes. You'll be thanking me when we're sitting by the fire tonight. Completely off the grid. When they finally arrived, the cabin looked almost exactly like the photos, almost. The pictures hadn't captured the weathered wood, the faint sag of the porch, or the shutters hanging askew. It's rustic, Eric offered, unloading their bags from the car. Rustic? Zoe laughed. Try borderline condemned. Despite their jokes, there was an undeniable charm to the place. The air smelled of pine and fresh earth, and a nearby creek bubbled softly, breaking the heavy silence of the forest. Tara retrieved the keys from a lockbox and ushered everyone inside. The interior was dim, with thick wooden beams and outdated furnishings. A massive stone fireplace dominated the main room, its hearth blackened from years of use. The group split up to explore. Guys. Max's voice echoed from the second floor. Everyone rushed upstairs to find him standing in a small attic room. Dust motes swirled in the pale light streaming through a cracked window. In the center of the room was a wooden chest, its hinges rusted. Creepy attic? Check, Max said, grinning. What are the odds there's something haunted in there? Don't touch it, Claire said immediately. Just let's leave it alone. Zoe chuckled. Relax. It's just a chest, probably full of moth-eaten quilts or something. Max shrugged and left it untouched for now. That evening, they lit a fire in the hearth, laughing as they passed around drinks and shared old stories. The atmosphere was light, the earlier unease forgotten, until the scratching started. It was faint at first, a subtle sound beneath the crackle of the fire. Claire was the first to notice. She stiffened, glancing toward the window. Did you hear that? Hear what? Sam asked. That scratching. Everyone paused, listening. There it was again, a faint, irregular scrape, like nails against wood. Probably just a raccoon, Eric said, leaning back in his chair. Or something bigger, Max added with a grin. The group chuckled nervously, but no one seemed eager to investigate. Eventually, the sound stopped, and they returned to their conversation, though the laughter was quieter now. The next morning, while the others prepared breakfast, Zoe couldn't resist the attic's pull. She crept upstairs, her curiosity outweighing her apprehension. The chest was surprisingly light when she lifted the lid. Inside was a single item, an old leather-bound journal. Its cover was cracked and worn, the edges frayed. Flipping through the pages, Zoe found frantic, nearly illegible handwriting. The entry spoke of sleepless nights, strange noises, and the overwhelming feeling of being watched. One entry stood out. If you find this, leave. The Watcher does not forgive. The Watcher does not forget. Zoe closed the journal, her stomach twisting. She decided not to tell the others just yet. That night, the scratching returned, louder and more persistent. It moved along the walls, circling the cabin. Tara locked the doors, her face pale. "Okay, that's not a raccoon," she said. "Probably the wind," Eric suggested weakly. "Wind doesn't scratch." Claire snapped. Suddenly, there was a loud thud against the back door. Everyone froze. "Should we check?" Sam whispered. "Hell no," Max replied, gripping a poker from the fireplace. The thudding stopped, replaced by silence so oppressive it made the air feel heavy. Then, the power went out. By the flickering light of the fire, the group huddled together. Zoe finally revealed the journal, reading the passages aloud. "It's just some crazy person," Eric said, though his voice shook. "Crazy enough to live out here and mess with us?" Max countered, as if in response. The scratching resumed. This time, it was accompanied by a faint tapping at the windows. Claire glanced toward the nearest one and screamed. A shadowy figure stood just outside, its outline barely visible in the firelight. "Everyone upstairs," Tara shouted. They scrambled up the narrow staircase, barricading themselves in one of the bedrooms. The scratching followed them, now coming from the bedroom door. "Do you think it can get in?" Zoe whispered, as if answering her question. The door handle began to turn. The door burst open, revealing nothing. The hallway was empty. "Okay, I'm done," Max said, grabbing a flashlight. "We're leaving." "You can't be serious," Tara said. "It's pitch black out there, and it's not safe in here." Reluctantly, the group agreed, armed with flashlights and anything they could use as a weapon. They ventured into the night. The forest was eerily silent, the air thick with tension. Every rustle of leaves, every snapped twig, sent their hearts racing. Behind them, the cabin's windows glowed faintly, though no one had left the fire burning. As they neared the car, a guttural growl stopped them in their tracks. From the shadows emerged the figure, its shape human but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its eyes glinting like wet stones in the darkness. "It's not human," Claire whispered, her voice trembling. The group ran, weaving through the trees. The figure pursued them, its movements unnaturally fast and fluid. Zoe tripped, her flashlight clattering to the ground. The figure loomed over her, but before it could strike, Max hurled a rock at its head. "Go!" he shouted, dragging Zoe to her feet. They reached the car just as the first hints of dawn painted the sky. Eric fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. The engine roared to life, and they sped down the dirt road, leaving the cabin and the figure behind. Back home, they tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was a prank, they told themselves. Maybe their minds had played tricks in the isolation. But weeks later, when Sam woke to find faint scratches on his bedroom window, he realized the truth. The Watcher had followed them. Story: The Cold Case of Jane Doe. Imagine stumbling upon a discovery so chilling it refuses to leave your mind. A young woman, her body dismembered and discarded like garbage. Her name erased, her story forgotten. Now imagine this: decades pass, and her file collects dust in the forgotten corners of a cold case room. She becomes nothing more than a statistic, a ghost of the unsolved. What would it take for someone to bring her story to light? What secrets could lie in the shadows of her past, waiting to be uncovered? Tonight, we delve into the chilling case of Jane Doe, a young woman whose life and death were shrouded in mystery. Who was she? What cruel hand ended her life? And perhaps most hauntingly, why was her story buried alongside her body? As the investigation unfolds, we'll journey into the mind of a determined investigator who uncovers a trail of dark truths that lead to a shocking revelation about a trusted figure in the victim's life. But the question remains, can justice ever be served when the answers are found too late? Or are some stories destined to haunt us forever? It began like so many cold cases, with an anonymous tip and a grisly discovery. It was 1993, late summer, when a truck driver pulled his rig to the side of a rural highway in Marshall County, Mississippi. He had intended to take a quick break, to stretch his legs and enjoy the solitude of the trees lining the road. But the smell hit him first. It was a pungent, sickly sweet odor that triggered a primal unease in his gut. He followed it, cautiously stepping off the shoulder of the road and into the underbrush. That's when he saw them, two black trash bags, carelessly tossed at the base of a tree. He moved closer, dreading what he might find. When he tore open the first bag, he froze. A torso, mangled and bloated, stared back at him, the flesh marred by the elements. Trembling, he stumbled away, fumbling for his phone to call the police. When investigators arrived, they discovered the second bag contained the victim's legs, but her head, hands, and feet were missing. Whoever had killed her had gone to great lengths to ensure she could never be identified. At the time of the discovery, the case had shocked the small community. The local papers dubbed her Jane Doe, a name that would stick for decades. Early efforts to identify her proved fruitless. With no head, no fingerprints, and no missing person report matching her description, investigators hit a wall almost immediately. Weeks turned into months, and months into years. The case grew colder by the day. Despite the gruesome details, Jane Doe's file was eventually relegated to the cold case archives, a grim reminder of the justice she never received. It wasn't until decades later, when advancements in technology made reopening cold cases a possibility, that her story resurfaced. Enter Michael Garrett, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for solving the unsolvable. For Garrett, the case wasn't just another file. It was personal. He had grown up in Marshall County and remembered the chilling discovery vividly. The idea that someone could die so brutally and be forgotten felt like an insult to justice itself. Garrett started with the basics, combing through the original case file. The details were sparse. The condition of the body suggested the woman was in her early 20s, possibly a drug user or sex worker based on the needle marks on her arms. A set of boot prints, size 12, had been found leading to and from the scene, but they had never led to a suspect. The first lead Garrett pursued was DNA. Decades earlier, DNA technology was in its infancy, but now it offered a glimmer of hope. Jane Doe's remains had been preserved, and Garrett submitted samples to a national database. Weeks passed before a match came back, not to Jane Doe herself, but to a distant relative. It was a breakthrough, albeit a small one. Using the DNA match, Garrett traced the family tree and found himself contacting an elderly woman in Louisiana who claimed to have had a niece that went missing in the early 90s. Her name was Emily Ward. Emily Ward had vanished in 1991, just 2 years before Jane Doe's body was found. She had been 18 at the time and had a troubled home life. Her stepfather, Raymond Ward, had been strict to the point of cruelty, and her mother had been largely absent, emotionally detached from the struggles of her daughter. Emily's stepmother, however, had loved her like her own. She had filed the missing person report, though Raymond had been reluctant. He claimed Emily was rebellious and had likely run away. The description matched Jane Doe almost perfectly. Garrett felt a rush of excitement as he compared Emily's case file to Jane Doe's. The timeline, the age, the physical characteristics, they all lined up. But something nagged at him. The DNA match was only partial. Garrett decided to dig deeper into Emily's family history, and what he uncovered sent chills down his spine. Raymond Ward was not Emily's biological father, a fact that wasn't shocking in itself. But Garrett discovered that Raymond had a criminal record, something he had successfully hidden for decades. In his younger years, he had been arrested for indecent exposure and, more disturbingly, for attempted kidnapping. Garrett's instincts told him Raymond wasn't just an abusive father figure. He might have been much more. As he dug into Raymond's past, he uncovered a pattern of disturbing behavior. Former neighbors described him as controlling, quick-tempered, and territorial. A former coworker recalled overhearing Raymond make comments about fixing his stepdaughter's attitude. Garrett's investigation came to a head when he uncovered a chilling detail. Raymond had abruptly left town just days after Emily was reported missing. His departure was sudden, unexplained, and left no forwarding address. Garrett suspected that this wasn't a coincidence. But the most damning piece of evidence came from Emily's stepmother. She described how, in the months leading up to Emily's disappearance, Raymond's behavior had grown increasingly erratic. Emily had confided in her stepmother, saying she felt unsafe and believed Raymond was watching her every move. Garrett pieced together a theory. Raymond had likely killed Emily in a fit of rage or control and had gone to great lengths to cover his tracks. He had dismembered her body to avoid identification, then dumped it in the woods, believing it would never be found. But Garrett was missing one critical piece of evidence: Raymond himself. Tracking Raymond proved nearly impossible. He had changed his name multiple times, using stolen identities to evade detection. Garrett hit dead end after dead end, each more frustrating than the last. The authorities were reluctant to allocate resources to chase down a man who might not even be alive anymore. Garrett felt the weight of the system's limitations pressing down on him. Still, he couldn't let it go. In the end, Garrett had to accept a bitter truth. Some cases are destined to remain unsolved. Jane Doe's identity was all but confirmed, and yet justice for Emily Ward felt out of reach. Raymond Ward had vanished, leaving behind nothing but questions and a trail of shattered lives. Garrett closed the file with a heavy heart, haunted by the knowledge that Jane Doe would never truly rest. Her story had been unearthed, but the answers she deserved were forever out of reach. As Garrett walked away from the case, he couldn't help but wonder how many more stories lay buried, waiting to be uncovered. How many more Jane Does would haunt the dark corners of the world, their voices silenced but never forgotten? Story: the creepy forest encounter. Forests are supposed to be peaceful, aren't they? The whisper of leaves, the soft crunch of twigs underfoot, and the feeling of being surrounded by nature's quiet beauty. It's easy to forget how isolated they can make you. But isolation is a double-edged sword. One minute, it's calming. The next, it's terrifying. I learned that lesson the hard way during a walk that could have cost me far more than I ever imagined. It was a warm afternoon, and my best friend Haley and I decided to explore the forest near our small town. We'd walked that trail dozens of times, finding comfort in the familiar path that wound its way through the dense trees. But on this particular day, something felt off. About halfway into our walk, I got the distinct feeling we were being watched. I glanced over my shoulder and saw him, a tall man standing just far enough behind us to seem casual, but close enough to make my heart pound. Would you trust your instincts in a moment like that? Or would you brush off the fear until it was too late? It started as an ordinary day. Haley and I had spent the morning lounging in my backyard, laughing and talking about everything from school drama to plans for the summer. By the time noon rolled around, we were restless. Let's go to the trail, Haley suggested, her eyes lighting up. I could use some fresh air. The forest trail was one of our favorite spots. It wasn't far from my house, and its winding paths and hidden clearings felt like our little secret. We packed some water, leashed up my dog Luna, and set out. The trail entrance was unassuming, a narrow dirt path cutting through the thick underbrush. But once inside, the forest opened up into a maze of trees, their towering trunks creating a canopy of green. Luna bounded ahead, her tail wagging as she darted between the bushes. For the first 20 minutes, everything was perfect. The sunlight filtered through the leaves, birds chirped in the distance, and the earthy scent of the forest filled the air. Haley and I talked and laughed, our voices echoing softly through the trees. But then, I felt it, a prickling at the back of my neck, like someone's eyes were on me. At first, I thought I was imagining things. I told myself it was just the natural eeriness of the forest, the way shadows seemed to move even when nothing was there. But as we rounded a bend in the trail, I glanced back and saw him. He was about 50 feet behind us, walking at a slow, deliberate pace. His clothes were nondescript, dark jeans and a faded jacket, and his face was partially hidden beneath a baseball cap. "Haley," I whispered, nudging her. "Don't look now, but there's a guy behind us." Haley frowned. "Maybe he's just out for a walk?" "Maybe," I said, my voice shaky. But why isn't he passing us? There's plenty of room. We decided to pick up the pace, hoping to put some distance between us and the stranger. Luna seemed to sense my unease, her ears twitching as she stayed closer to my side. But no matter how fast we walked, the man stayed behind us, always keeping the same distance. The forest, which had felt so welcoming just moments ago, now felt suffocating. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump. I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder, and every time I did, the man was there, matching our pace. We should turn back, I whispered to Haley. And walk right past him, she shot back, her voice laced with fear. She was right. Turning back wasn't an option. We had to keep moving forward. The trail began to narrow, the trees pressing closer together as the sunlight grew dimmer. My heart pounded in my chest, my mind racing with questions. Who was this man? Why was he following us? And what would he do if he caught up? Haley pulled out her phone, her hands shaking as she tried to call her mom. No signal. Of course, she muttered, shoving the phone back into her pocket. We rounded another bend and spotted a clearing up ahead. Relief flooded through me. It was the end of the trail, where a dirt road led to the edge of a gated community. If we could make it there, we'd be safe. But as we neared the clearing, I heard it, the sound of footsteps quickening behind us. Run, I shouted, grabbing Haley's arm. We bolted down the trail, Luna barking wildly as she sprinted alongside us. The footsteps behind us grew louder, the man's heavy breaths mixing with the crunch of leaves underfoot. The clearing seemed impossibly far away, the trees blurring as we ran. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they were moving through molasses. But I didn't dare slow down. Finally, we burst into the open, the dirt road stretching out before us. The gated community wall loomed just ahead, its smooth concrete surface offering the promise of safety. Climb it, I gasped, pushing Haley toward the wall. She hesitated for a split second before scrambling up, using the rough patches of brick for leverage. I boosted her as best I could, my hands slipping on the cold stone. Behind me, the man emerged from the trees, his face now fully visible. His expression was twisted into something between anger and determination, and in his hand, I saw a glint of metal. Adrenaline surged through me as I grabbed Luna's leash and hoisted myself up the wall. Haley reached down, pulling me up just as the man lunged forward, his outstretched hand grazing the heel of my shoe. We tumbled over the wall, landing in a heap on the other side. My knees scraped against the pavement, but I barely noticed the pain. A man walking his dog nearby rushed over, his expression a mix of concern and confusion. "Are you girls okay?" he asked, helping us to our feet. "There's a man," I panted, pointing toward the wall. He was chasing us. The dog walker didn't hesitate. He pulled out his phone and called the police, keeping an eye on the wall as we huddled together. The man didn't try to climb after us. Instead, he stood on the other side, staring at us with a look that sent chills down my spine. Then, without a word, he turned and disappeared back into the forest. The police arrived quickly, taking our statements and searching the area, but they never found the man. For weeks, I couldn't shake the image of his face or the sound of his footsteps chasing us through the trees. The forest, once my favorite place, now felt tainted, its beauty overshadowed by the memory of that day. I stopped walking the trail, even during the day. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow in the corner of my eye made my heart race. Haley and I talked about the encounter often, replaying every detail and asking the same questions. Who was he? Why was he following us? What would have happened if we hadn't escaped? We never got answers. But one thing was clear. That day changed us. It made us more cautious, more aware of the dangers lurking in the places we once felt safe. Looking back, I wonder if we could have done anything differently. Should we have confronted him? Tried to lose him earlier? Or was running our only option? Sometimes, I think about the man and what might have driven him to follow us. Was he dangerous? Or was he just looking to scare us? Either way, his actions left a scar that time hasn't fully healed. What would you have done in our place? Could you have stayed calm? Or would fear have taken over? Story: The Dangerous Trail, Trails have always felt like home to me. There's something about the way the trees cocoon you, their leaves whispering secrets in the breeze, the dirt path crunching softly beneath your feet. They hold a kind of magic, a promise of peace and solitude. At least, that's what I thought before that day. Haley and I had been planning this hike for weeks. It wasn't anything serious, just a leisurely stroll through the forest trail near my house. It was our spot, the one place we could escape the noise of school, family, and everything else that made teenage life chaotic. That afternoon, the sky was a brilliant blue, and the sun filtered gently through the canopy above, creating dappled patterns on the path. Birds chirped cheerily in the distance, their songs blending harmoniously with the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Luna, my golden retriever, bounded ahead of us, her nose twitching at every scent. We laughed and chatted as we walked, our conversation ranging from the latest school gossip to our plans for the summer. Everything about the day felt perfect. But then, somewhere along the trail, the forest grew quiet. It wasn't an immediate change. At first, I barely noticed, but as we continued walking, the absence of sound became impossible to ignore. The birds had stopped singing, and even the rustling leaves seemed to have stilled. Is it just me, or is it a little too quiet? Haley asked, her voice breaking the unnatural hush. I nodded, a prickling sensation creeping up the back of my neck. Yeah, it's weird. Maybe there's a storm coming? But there were no dark clouds, no wind picking up to signal a change in the weather. Just the eerie stillness that felt heavy, like the forest itself was holding its breath. That's when we saw him. He was far down the trail, little more than a silhouette against the dappled light. A man, dressed in dark jeans and a hoodie, his hands shoved into his pockets. He walked slowly, his head slightly bowed as if lost in thought. At first glance, he didn't seem threatening, but there was something about the way he moved, too steady, too deliberate, that set my nerves on edge. Probably just another hiker, Haley said, though her voice lacked conviction. Yeah, probably. I agreed, though my stomach churned with unease. We kept walking, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. But every time I glanced back, he was there, always the same distance behind us. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he just happened to be heading the same way. It was, after all, a popular trail. But as we rounded a bend and took a side path that looped back toward the entrance, he followed. Okay, that's not normal, Haley muttered, her voice low. No, it's not. I agreed, my pulse quickening. We decided to pick up the pace, turning onto a narrower path that cut through a denser part of the woods. The trees here were closer together, their thick trunks casting long shadows over the trail. Luna trotted alongside us, her ears flicking nervously. She was usually fearless, but now she stayed close, her tail tucked low. The man didn't speed up, but he didn't fall behind either. He maintained the same measured pace, his presence a constant weight pressing on my chest. Do you think we should say something? Haley whispered. And what if he's dangerous? I shot back. She didn't respond. The trail twisted and turned, leading us deeper into the woods. Every time we thought we'd lost him, he appeared again, his dark figure emerging from the trees like a specter. Haley and I exchanged a glance, the silent understanding passing between us. We needed to run. Ready? I asked, my voice barely audible. She nodded. Now. We took off, our feet pounding against the dirt path. Luna barked sharply, her leash tugging at my hand as she sprinted alongside us. The air was thick with the scent of pine and earth, but all I could focus on was the sound of footsteps behind us, heavy, relentless, gaining ground. My lungs burned as we pushed ourselves harder, the trail blurring in front of me. Branches snagged at my clothes, and the uneven ground threatened to trip me with every step. Where does this go? Haley shouted, her voice strained with panic. There's a gate ahead. I managed between gasps. The gate. It was our only hope. The clearing came into view, the gate standing at its far edge like a beacon of salvation. It was old and rusted, its bars streaked with patches of orange from years of weathering. Beyond it lay a residential neighborhood, a safe haven if we could just reach it. Go, I urged Haley, shoving her toward the gate as we burst into the clearing. She reached it first, throwing her weight against the heavy metal. The gate groaned as it swung open, just wide enough for her to slip through. I followed, dragging Luna behind me, but as I turned to close the gate, the man appeared at the edge of the clearing, his face finally visible. It was twisted with frustration, or was it something darker? His eyes locked on mine, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. Then he sprinted toward us. I slammed the gate shut just as he reached it, the metal rattling violently as he grabbed the bars and shook them with a feral intensity. "Get back," Haley shouted, her voice trembling. Luna barked furiously, her teeth bared as she lunged at the gate. The man didn't flinch, his eyes burning with an unspoken threat. But then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he stopped, his grip loosened, and he stepped back, his expression unreadable. Without a word, he turned and disappeared into the woods. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The only sound was Luna's panting, her chest heaving as she pressed against my leg. "Are you okay?" Haley asked, her voice shaking. I nodded, though my entire body trembled. "Yeah, you?" "Barely," she admitted. We sat on the curb, trying to catch our breath. A jogger passing by stopped, concern etched across his face. "Everything all right?" "There was a man." I stammered. "He was following us. He chased us." The jogger wasted no time calling the police, staying with us until they arrived. Officers searched the area and took our statements, but the man was gone, leaving no trace behind. For weeks, I couldn't shake the memory of his face. It haunted me in my dreams, his burning eyes and the way he stood so silently at the gate. Haley and I vowed never to go back to that trail, no matter how much we missed it. Even Luna seemed affected, barking at shadows and staying close whenever we ventured outdoors. I still wonder what he wanted. Was he just trying to scare us? Or did he have darker intentions? The not knowing is what keeps me awake at night, replaying the chase over and over in my mind. Trails, once my sanctuary, now feel like traps, places where danger can lurk behind every tree, waiting for the right moment to strike. What would you have done in our place? Would you have run? Or would you have confronted him? Story: the destroyed case file. The sound of tires crunching gravel was the only noise in the quiet cul-de-sac as Terry Marshall pulled into the driveway. The house ahead was small but well kept, with a garden that spoke of care and patience. Inside, Terry knew, waited a family clinging to hope, a family that had been waiting for decades. He killed the engine, leaning his head back against the seat for a moment. Taking this case had been a decision born out of both curiosity and frustration. Retirement had dulled the edge of his days, but this call had reignited something inside him. Yet as he sat there, the weight of what lay ahead settled heavily on his chest. The victim's mother, Evelyn Larson, answered the door. She was in her 70s now, her face lined with time and grief. Her hands trembled as she invited Terry inside, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for coming," she said, leading him to the living room. Framed photographs lined the walls, each one a snapshot of happier times. Among them was a portrait of a young woman with a radiant smile. Her auburn hair caught the light in a way that made her seem alive. "That's my daughter," Evelyn said, her voice breaking. Julie Larson had been just 22 when she was murdered in 1983, strangled and dumped off a bridge. Her case had gone cold after only a few months. The police had told Evelyn they were doing everything they could, but the years passed, and the phone stopped ringing. "We just want to know what happened," Evelyn said, her hands clutching a tissue. "We deserve that much, don't we?" Terry nodded. "You do," he said, "and I'll do everything I can to find out." Terry's first step was to request Julie's case file from the Milwaukee Police Department. It was a formality, but one he hoped would yield insights the family hadn't been privy to. The initial call was uneventful. A clerk noted the case number and promised to locate the file. But as days turned into weeks, Terry began to suspect something was amiss. Follow-up calls were met with vague assurances that the search was ongoing. Finally, on his third attempt, Terry was transferred to a captain who delivered the news. "I'm sorry to tell you this," the captain said, his tone clipped, But the case file was destroyed during a departmental reorganization in the mid-1990s. Terry felt his stomach drop. Destroyed? How does that happen with an open case? It was a mistake, the captain replied. We've implemented new protocols since then to ensure it doesn't happen again. The words felt hollow, rehearsed. Terry pressed for details, but the captain offered none. Look, the captain added, there's nothing else I can do. I wish you luck. The line went dead, leaving Terry staring at his phone in disbelief. Files didn't just go missing. Terry had spent enough time in law enforcement to know that every piece of evidence, every report, was cataloged and tracked. Mistakes happened, sure, but not with this frequency. Unable to access the original file, Terry turned to the people who had been closest to the case. He tracked down retired officers, journalists who had covered the story, and even former co-workers who might have insights. What he uncovered painted a troubling picture. One retired detective remembered the case vividly. Julie's death wasn't random, he said. There were whispers about her being involved with someone important, someone with connections. Connections to who? Terry asked. The detective hesitated. There was a businessman, Martin Caldwell. He was questioned early on but never charged. His name kept coming up in other cases, though. The name didn't mean much to Terry at first, but as he dug deeper, it began to appear with unsettling frequency. Caldwell, a wealthy developer, had ties to several cold cases in the area. Terry's instincts told him that Caldwell was more than a person of interest, but without the case file, proving it would be nearly impossible. Terry's frustration grew as he encountered more roadblocks. It wasn't just Julie's case file that had been destroyed. Dozens of cold cases from the 1980s and early 1990s had been wiped out during the so-called reorganization. The official explanation was that the department had run out of storage space and had prioritized solved cases for destruction. But Terry found this hard to believe. He reached out to a former records clerk, Margaret Hill, who had worked during the time of the purge. Margaret, now in her 80s, agreed to meet with him at a local coffee shop. They said it was about storage, she told him, her voice tinged with bitterness. But it wasn't. We had plenty of space. They picked and chose which files to destroy. Picked and chose? Terry asked, leaning in. Margaret nodded. It wasn't random. Someone went through those files. I remember seeing a stack on the captain's desk, cases flagged for disposal. When I asked about it, he told me to mind my business. Who gave the order? Margaret hesitated, glancing around the room. I don't know for sure, but I can tell you this. Those cases all had one thing in common. They involved powerful people. Margaret's revelation sent chills down Terry's spine. If the destruction of the files had been deliberate, it meant someone within the department had gone to great lengths to protect certain individuals. Terry compiled a list of the affected cases, cross-referencing them with news articles and witness statements. Patterns began to emerge, suspects with ties to politicians, wealthy businessmen, and even law enforcement officials. One name appeared more than any other, Martin Caldwell. Caldwell had been questioned in connection with 3 different disappearances, all young women, but he had never been charged. Each time, investigators had cited a lack of evidence. Terry's gut told him this wasn't a coincidence. The breakthrough came when Terry received an anonymous email. The sender claimed to have worked with Caldwell during the 1980s and had information that might be useful. They agreed to meet in a parking garage late at night, a scene straight out of a crime thriller. The man, who introduced himself only as Paul, was visibly nervous. Caldwell's a monster, Paul said, his voice barely above a whisper. He had connections everywhere, police, judges, you name it. If someone got too close to exposing him, they disappeared. Paul provided details that confirmed Terry's suspicions. Caldwell had used his wealth and influence to manipulate investigations, ensuring that evidence against him was either buried or destroyed. Why are you coming forward now? Terry asked. Paul hesitated. I'm tired of living with it. People need to know the truth. Armed with Paul's testimony, Terry felt he was close to unraveling the conspiracy, but without hard evidence. His findings were little more than allegations. He presented his case to the district attorney, But the response was lukewarm. "There's no statute of limitations on murder," the DA said, "but we need more than hearsay to move forward." Terry left the meeting feeling defeated. He had spent months piecing together the truth, only to be met with indifference. In the end, Terry was forced to accept the limits of his investigation. Caldwell remained untouchable, his crimes buried beneath layers of corruption and neglect. For Julie's family, the lack of closure was devastating. Evelyn Larson passed away a year later, never knowing the full truth about her daughter's death. Terry, too, was haunted by the case. The destroyed files were more than a clerical error. They were a betrayal of the very principles he had sworn to uphold. As he packed away his notes, Terry couldn't help but wonder how many more secrets lay buried in the shadows, protected by those who were supposed to deliver justice, and perhaps most chillingly, how many more lives had been lost, erased from history by the actions of a few powerful men. Story: The Girl at the Cemetery. Autumn nights in Lancaster held a certain charm, a blend of crisp air and faint wood smoke that whispered of approaching winter. I'd always found peace in those nights, an escape from the weight of university life. Running was my sanctuary, a ritual I rarely missed. It was 2015, my third year at Lancaster University, and I'd grown accustomed to the quiet rhythm of the town. Nestled in northern England, Lancaster was quaint, its cobblestone streets and old-world charm offering a stark contrast to the sprawling university campus. By then, I'd mapped out every trail and street, seeking solace in my evening runs. That night was no different, or so I thought. The air had a bite to it, the kind that stings your lungs when you breathe too deeply. My usual route led me through Williamson Park, a sprawling expanse of greenery crowned by a butterfly house atop its highest hill. Beyond the park lay something entirely different, a vast cemetery, ancient and sprawling. I'd passed it countless times without a second thought. The graveyard was beautiful in a morbid sort of way. Old, towering yew trees stretched their gnarled branches toward the sky, and ivy crept over tombstones, so weathered their inscriptions were little more than whispers of names long forgotten. At the heart of the cemetery was a crypt, its stone doors sealed and its surface scarred by time and graffiti. It wasn't the cemetery itself that unnerved me. It was what lay beyond it. Stories of the abandoned mental asylum on the far side were infamous in town, though long shuttered. It was said that echoes of its grim history lingered, and those brave, or foolish, enough to venture into its ruins often spoke of inexplicable phenomena. Shadows moving in the corners of their vision, disembodied voices, and an unshakable sense of being watched. But those were just stories. I adjusted my headphones, letting the pounding rhythm of heavy metal drown out the night as I approached the cemetery gates. The wrought iron stood tall and imposing, its spikes reaching toward the heavens like a warning to the living. And that's when I saw her. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. She was just a small figure at the edge of the path, motionless against the backdrop of shadow and stone. I slowed my pace, my breath fogging in the cold air, and tugged out one earbud. The girl stood just inside the gates, her pale face streaked with tears. She was dressed in a thin, sleeveless dress, far too light for the biting chill of an autumn evening. Her bare feet were planted firmly on the gravel path, and her small frame trembled. "Hey," I called, hesitant. "Are you okay?" Her head snapped toward me, and I saw the sheer terror in her eyes. She couldn't have been more than 9 or 10, her features delicate and childlike. She looked as though she'd been running or fleeing from something. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Please help me." I glanced around, half expecting to see someone following her. The street was empty, the surrounding houses dark and silent. Beyond the gates, the cemetery stretched into an inky blackness that seemed to swallow all light. "What's wrong? Are you lost?" I asked, stepping closer. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she glanced back into the cemetery, her wide eyes scanning the darkness as though expecting something or someone to emerge. Her hands trembled as she clutched the cold metal of the gate. "Please," she repeated, her voice breaking. "He's coming." The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The way she said it, the raw fear in her voice, sent a chill racing down my spine. My instincts screamed at me to leave. But how could I? She was just a child, alone and terrified. I pulled out my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed 999. "It's okay," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'll call the police. They'll know what to do." But as soon as the word police left my lips, her demeanor changed. Her trembling stopped, and she looked up at me with wide, unblinking eyes. For a moment, it felt as though the world around us had gone completely still. "No," she said sharply, her voice taking on an edge I hadn't heard before. "No police." I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the call button. "But you said you needed help. They can?" "No," she shouted, stepping back. Her voice was suddenly fierce, almost angry. I froze, unsure of what to do. My mind raced with questions. Why didn't she want the police? Was she in some kind of trouble? Was someone chasing her? Or was she running from something far worse? Before I could ask, she turned and bolted into the cemetery. "Wait," I called, but she didn't stop. Her small figure disappeared into the darkness, swallowed by the labyrinth of headstones and trees. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing down on me like a physical weight. I stood there, paralyzed by indecision. Every logical part of me screamed to leave, to run back to the safety of the well-lit streets. But something stronger, a mix of curiosity and dread, kept me rooted to the spot. What if she was in danger? What if someone or something was out there? Against my better judgment, I stepped through the gates. The gravel crunched beneath my feet as I entered the cemetery. The air felt colder here, heavier, as though the night itself was holding its breath. My phone's flashlight cast a feeble beam, illuminating only a few feet ahead. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. "Are you there? Are you okay?" No answer. The path wound deeper into the cemetery, and the shadows seemed to grow darker with every step. The rows of tombstones loomed like silent sentinels, their inscriptions barely visible beneath layers of moss and ivy. That's when I heard it, a faint sound, barely audible over the pounding of my heart. It was the soft crunch of footsteps on gravel, coming from somewhere ahead. "Hello?" I called again, my voice breaking. The footsteps stopped. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The beam swept over the path ahead, illuminating only more darkness. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A shadow darted between the trees, too fast to be human. My breath hitched, and I swung the flashlight toward the movement. But there was nothing there. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. My legs screamed at me to turn back, to run, but I couldn't move. Suddenly, a voice whispered from the darkness, soft and chilling, "You shouldn't be here." The flashlight shook in my hand as I whipped it toward the source of the voice. The beam caught a figure standing just beyond the edge of the path. It was the girl. She stood perfectly still, her pale skin almost glowing in the faint light. Her expression was unreadable, her eyes fixed on me. "Why did you follow me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to help," I stammered. "You said someone was coming. Are you in danger?" Her gaze shifted past me, toward the cemetery gates. "He's still coming," she said softly. Before I could respond, the temperature around me seemed to plummet. My breath fogged in the icy air, and a deep, guttural sound rumbled from the shadows behind her. My body moved before my mind could process what was happening. I turned and ran, the flashlight's beam bouncing wildly as I sprinted back toward the gates. The sound followed me, heavy, thudding footsteps and a low growl that sent chills down my spine. I didn't dare look back. The gates loomed ahead, and I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning with every breath. I burst through the iron gates and didn't stop running until I reached the brightly lit streets of town. Only then did I dare to glance back. The cemetery was silent and still, the gates standing open as if nothing had happened. There was no sign of the girl, or whatever had been following me. I never ran at night again. The memory of that encounter haunted me, the unanswered questions gnawing at the edges of my mind. Who was the girl? What was she running from? And why did she vanish into the darkness so willingly? I told myself it was just my imagination, that I'd let the eerie setting get the better of me. But deep down, I knew better. Some things defy explanation. Even now, years later, I can't walk past that cemetery without feeling a chill creep up my spine. The girl's face lingers in my memory, her whispered plea echoing in my mind. Please, help me. But the truth is, I couldn't, and I don't think anyone ever could. Story: The Girl in the Woods. The woods at night are a place of contradictions. Beneath the canopy, the world feels vast and empty, yet every shadow hides the unknown. For Jake and Lauren, an impromptu night hike on the Appalachian Trail was supposed to be a challenge, a daring adventure under a moonlit sky. But as they rounded a bend deep in the forest, they heard it, a faint cry, muffled and broken by the wind. Jake stopped in his tracks, gripping Lauren's arm. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Lauren nodded, her face pale in the dim light. The cry came again, closer this time. It wasn't an animal. It was a person, a woman. They followed the sound, their flashlights cutting through the inky darkness. What they found chilled them to their core. A young woman, barefoot and disheveled, stumbled toward them. Her hair clung to her sweat-drenched face, and her hands were trembling. "They're out there," she gasped. "He's still out there." Before Jake could respond, a distant rustling in the trees made them all freeze. Something, or someone, was watching them. Would you keep going if the shadows in the woods were alive? Jake and Lauren were no strangers to the trail. Seasoned hikers with years of experience, they had always found solace in the wilderness. But that night was different. The idea to take a moonlit hike had been Jake's, an opportunity to experience the forest in a way few dared to. "We'll stay on the main trail," Jake had assured her as they laced up their boots. "It's safe. People do night hikes all the time." Lauren wasn't convinced but agreed anyway. The idea of walking through the forest under the stars held a certain allure, even if the darkness made her uneasy. The first hour of their hike was peaceful. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting soft silver shadows on the path. Crickets chirped in the distance, and the cool night air was refreshing. But as they ventured deeper into the forest, the atmosphere began to change. The sounds of the night grew quieter. The trees seemed to close in, and an unsettling stillness settled over the trail. The first cry was faint, almost indistinguishable from the rustling leaves. Jake dismissed it at first, assuming it was an animal. But the second cry was unmistakable, a human voice, laced with fear. Lauren stopped abruptly. "That's a person," she said, her voice trembling. Jake shone his flashlight toward the source of the sound, but the beam only illuminated more trees. "Stay close," he said, stepping off the trail. They followed the cries, their footsteps crunching on the dry leaves. The forest seemed darker now, the trees more menacing. Every rustle in the underbrush made Lauren jump. Finally, they saw her. The young woman appeared out of the shadows, her thin frame swaying as she stumbled toward them. Her clothes were torn, her bare feet caked with dirt, and her face was etched with panic. "Please," she whispered, clutching Jake's arm. "You have to help me. He's still out there." Lauren knelt beside her. "Who? What happened?" The woman shook her head, her eyes darting to the darkness behind them. "I don't know. He came out of nowhere. I ran, but he'll find me." Jake's instincts kicked in. He scanned the woods with his flashlight, searching for any sign of movement. The beam flickered across the trees, but the shadows revealed nothing. "We need to get out of here," Lauren said, her voice tight. Jake nodded. "Can you walk?" he asked the woman. She shook her head, wincing as she tried to put weight on her leg. "My ankle. I think I twisted it." Jake cursed under his breath. Carrying her would slow them down, but leaving her behind wasn't an option. "Okay," he said. "We'll get back to the trailhead. It's about an hour from here. We'll move as fast as we can." As Jake lifted her onto his back, a sound behind them made them all freeze. It was faint at first, a steady rustling, like someone moving through the brush. Lauren gripped Jake's arm. "We're not alone," she whispered. They hurried back toward the trail, the young woman clinging to Jake's shoulders. Lauren led the way, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The rustling continued, growing louder. It wasn't constant. Whoever was following them was careful, stopping when they stopped, moving only when they moved. Keep going, Jake urged, his voice low. The tension was suffocating. Every step felt like a gamble, every shadow a potential threat. Then they saw it, a faint glimmer of light in the distance. The shelter. We're close, Lauren said, relief flooding her voice. But as they approached, their hope was shattered. The shelter wasn't empty. A man and a woman sat on the shelter's platform, their faces illuminated by a dim lantern. They were arguing, their voices low but heated. "Hey," Jake called out, startling them. The man stood, his expression wary. "Who are you?" "We need help," Jake said, setting the young woman down carefully. "She's hurt. Someone's following us." The woman in the shelter gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Out here? At night?" The man frowned. "Are you sure?" "Positive," Lauren snapped. "We've been hearing them for the last half hour." The man grabbed a flashlight and shone it into the woods. "I don't see anything." "That doesn't mean they're not there," Jake said, his voice sharp. As they debated what to do next, the rustling grew louder. It was no longer subtle. Whoever was out there wasn't hiding anymore. "Everyone inside," Jake ordered. They crowded into the shelter, the tension thick. Jake gripped a heavy branch he'd found outside, his knuckles white. Lauren held her flashlight like a weapon, ready to swing if necessary. The noises stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Then, without warning, a figure burst out of the trees. The man from the shelter was the first to react, swinging his flashlight at the intruder. The beam illuminated a gaunt, shadowy figure with wild eyes. The attacker lunged, and chaos erupted. Jake swung his makeshift weapon, striking the attacker's arm. The figure let out a guttural snarl, retreating into the darkness. "Is everyone okay?" Lauren gasped, her voice shaking. The group was unharmed, but their fear was palpable. They barricaded the shelter's entrance as best they could, using backpacks and branches to fortify their position. "We have to make it to daylight," Jake said. "It's too dangerous to move now." The hours crawled by, each minute stretching into eternity. The group took turns keeping watch, their nerves fraying with every sound. At one point, Lauren thought she saw movement in the trees, a fleeting shadow just beyond the firelight. But when she shone her flashlight, there was nothing there. The young woman they had found sat in the corner, her knees drawn to her chest. She didn't speak, her eyes fixed on the ground. When dawn finally broke, the group wasted no time. They carried the injured woman back to the trailhead, every step filled with the fear that the attacker might return. When they reached safety, they reported the incident to the authorities. Rangers searched the area but found no trace of the attacker. The experience left its mark on all of them. Jake and Lauren never took another night hike. The young woman disappeared from their lives, her fate unknown, and the woods? They remained, vast and silent, holding their secrets close. Would you dare venture into the wilderness, knowing what might be waiting? Story: the Gypsy Festival incident. When my parents announced that we were attending the Appleby Horse Fair, I wasn't sure what to expect. I'd heard stories about the festival from relatives, vivid tales of colorful caravans, spirited horses, and the infectious energy that brought together families, travelers, and curious onlookers alike. For my family, it was more than just a fair. It was a connection to a past we'd largely left behind. My grandparents had lived the true Romani life, traveling with their wagons and embracing the traditions passed down through generations. But my parents had traded that lifestyle for brick-and-mortar homes, steady jobs, and a more acceptable place in modern society. So the festival was an opportunity to reconnect with our roots, even if only for a few days. I was 14 at the time, and the idea of traveling with my family didn't excite me as much as it once might have. My parents' insistence that this was an important cultural experience only added to my reluctance. Still, part of me was curious. The festival was everything they had promised: vibrant, chaotic, and alive. Horses paraded down cobblestone streets, their manes braided with ribbons, while vendors sold handmade jewelry, colorful scarves, and traditional sweets. There was music everywhere, from fiddlers perched on street corners to booming speakers that thumped bass lines through the crowd. But even in the heart of all that life, there was an undercurrent of something else. It wasn't fear, exactly, but rather the sense that this was a place where old traditions clashed with modern recklessness, a place where anything could happen. My cousin Ellie was the same age as me, though far braver. She had a confidence that I envied, a way of making the world bend to her will. That afternoon, she convinced our parents to let us explore on our own. "We'll stay close," Ellie promised, her brown eyes wide with feigned innocence. "Just the main streets." I swear. Our parents reluctantly agreed, with the usual warnings to stick together and stay out of trouble. Ellie grabbed my hand as soon as we were out of sight, pulling me into the heart of the fair. We wandered through the stalls, laughed at the antics of performers, and sampled sugary snacks that left our fingers sticky. It felt freeing, being untethered from the watchful eyes of adults. For a while, I forgot my hesitations, caught up in the excitement of the day. And then we met them. They were a group of boys, probably a couple of years older than us. Ellie caught their attention first, as she always did, her confidence shining like a beacon. They approached with easy smiles, their accents marking them as locals. "You two enjoying the fair?" one of them asked, his voice warm and friendly. Ellie grinned. "We're loving it. You guys from around here?" The conversation flowed naturally, their charm putting us at ease. They teased us lightly, making jokes about the city girls trying to fit in with the travelers. It was all harmless, or so it seemed. "We know a quieter spot," one of them said after a while. "Less crowded, better view of the river. You should check it out." I hesitated, glancing at Ellie. Something about the suggestion felt off, but she shrugged and smiled. "Why not?" she said. "It sounds fun." We followed them down a winding path that led away from the bustling fair. The noise of the crowd grew fainter with each step, replaced by the rustle of leaves and the distant gurgle of the river. I felt the first pangs of unease. The boys were still chatting, but their laughter sounded hollow now, their easy camaraderie shifting into something more calculated. "Where exactly are we going?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just up ahead," one of them replied, flashing me a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The path narrowed, the trees closing in around us. The sunlight struggled to pierce the canopy, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly. My heart began to race. Finally, we stopped at a small clearing near the riverbank. The boys exchanged glances, their earlier friendliness fading into something colder. "This is it?" Ellie asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "Yeah," one of them said, stepping closer. "It's nice, isn't it?" Before I could react, one of the boys, the tallest and broadest of the group, grabbed me. His hands were rough and unyielding, locking around my waist as he lifted me off the ground. "Hey!" I shouted, kicking and squirming. "Let me go." Ellie froze, her face pale and her eyes wide with shock. The other boys stood motionless, their expressions blank, as though this was just another game. I thrashed wildly, adrenaline surging through me. My elbow connected with his jaw, and he let out a grunt of pain. "Help me!" I screamed, turning to Ellie. She took a hesitant step forward but stopped, her hands trembling. "Ellie, please," I pleaded, my voice cracking. The boy tightened his grip, dragging me toward the bushes at the edge of the clearing. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized how isolated we were. There was no one to hear me, no one to help, but I wasn't going down without a fight. I slammed my heel into his shin, eliciting another grunt. He stumbled, loosening his hold just enough for me to wriggle free. I hit the ground hard, the impact jarring, but I didn't stop. I scrambled to my feet and spun around, my eyes locking on his. "Stay away from me," I shouted, my voice trembling with both fear and defiance. Ellie grabbed my arm, and we bolted back toward the main path. My legs burned, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but I didn't dare slow down. The boys didn't chase us, whether it was my resistance or the sudden shift in their dynamic. They stayed behind, their figures fading into the shadows. When we reached the festival grounds, The noise and color were almost overwhelming. The crowd seemed oblivious to the nightmare we'd just escaped, their laughter and chatter a stark contrast to the terror still gripping me. We found a bench near the edge of the fair and collapsed onto it, our bodies trembling. What the hell was that? I demanded, my voice shaking. Ellie stared at the ground, tears streaming down her face. I didn't know what to do, she whispered. I wanted to scream at her, to demand why she hadn't helped me, but the words caught in my throat. The truth was, I understood. Fear paralyzes. We didn't tell our parents what happened. Shame, fear, and a strange sense of disbelief kept us silent. How could we explain it? How could we admit that we'd let ourselves be lured away so easily? For weeks, I couldn't stop replaying the encounter in my mind. The boy's grip, the look in his eyes, the way Ellie had frozen. It haunted me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the bushes, the shadows, the dark possibilities of what might have happened if I hadn't fought back. I stopped going to festivals. What had once seemed magical now felt dangerous. The crowds and chaos a breeding ground for predators. Years later, the memory still lingers. I've tried to rationalize it, to convince myself that it was just a group of stupid boys pushing boundaries they didn't fully understand. But deep down, I know better. There was malice in their actions, a darkness that went beyond youthful recklessness. I often wonder about the boy who grabbed me. Did he go on to hurt someone else? Did he ever feel regret? Or was I just one of many near misses in his life? More than anything, I think about Ellie. Our friendship wasn't the same after that day. The unspoken weight of what happened created a rift between us, one that time never fully healed. If I've learned anything, it's this: trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is, and never let fear silence you. Story: the haunting roommate. Moving into a shared apartment was a leap of faith. After a year in the cramped dormitories, I was ready for more space, more freedom. The modest 3-bedroom unit wasn't luxurious, but it was affordable, close to campus, and promised the peace I craved. Talia, the other tenant, was a dream roommate, quiet, tidy, and perpetually buried in her chemistry textbooks. The third room had remained vacant for weeks, but the landlord assured us a new tenant would be moving in soon. When Aiko arrived, it was past 10 p.m. on a rainy Saturday night. Her knock on the door was so soft I almost missed it. She stood there, petite and slightly hunched, her dark hair dripping wet and her suitcase trailing behind her. "Hi," she said, her English halting but clear. "I'm Aiko, your new roommate." I welcomed her in, showing her around the apartment as she offered small smiles and polite nods. Her voice was quiet, her movements deliberate, almost too precise. I chalked it up to nerves. She seemed sweet, I thought as I went to bed that night. If only I had known how wrong I was. For the first week, everything seemed normal. Aiko spent most of her time in her room, emerging occasionally to cook or ask me questions about the bus routes. She was reserved, almost shy, but always polite. She smiled faintly when I taught her how to navigate the subway or showed her where to find the best coffee near campus. Her gratitude felt genuine, and I started to think we'd get along just fine. But as the days turned into weeks, small things began to unsettle me. I'd catch her standing in the hallway, staring at my bedroom door. When I looked up from the couch, I'd find her watching me from the kitchen, her gaze steady and unblinking. At first, I brushed it off. She's just adjusting, I told myself. She's in a new country, surrounded by strangers. It must be overwhelming. But as her behavior grew more peculiar, my rationalizations began to falter. The first truly strange incident happened late one night. I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, when I glanced toward the window. The balcony connected all 3 bedrooms, a small shared space overlooking the quiet street below. I'd left my blinds half open, letting the glow of the streetlights filter in. That's when I saw her. Aiko stood on the balcony, her silhouette stark against the dim light. She was facing my window, her head tilted slightly, as if she were studying me. At first, I thought she hadn't noticed I was looking, but then her lips twitched, curling into a faint smile. My heart skipped a beat. I pulled the blinds shut, my hands shaking slightly. The next morning, I asked Talia if she'd noticed anything unusual about Aiko. "She's quiet," Talia said, barely looking up from her textbook. "Keeps to herself." "Why?" "No reason." I lied, but the unease lingered. The balcony stairs became a nightly occurrence. No matter what time I went to bed, Aiko seemed to be there, standing motionless, her gaze fixed on my window. I started keeping the blinds closed, but it didn't help. I could feel her presence, the weight of her eyes pressing through the thin fabric. Then, she started showing up in other places. I'd walk to the bus stop in the morning, and moments later, she'd appear, standing just a few feet away. She never said anything, never acknowledged me, but her timing was too perfect to be a coincidence. Once, I stopped at a cafe near campus to grab a coffee. As I waited in line, I felt a familiar prickle of unease. I turned, and there she was, sitting at a table in the corner, her hands folded neatly in her lap. When our eyes met, she smiled faintly, as if she'd been expecting me. The night everything escalated began like any other. I locked my bedroom door, a habit I developed over the past few weeks, and climbed into bed, hoping for an uninterrupted night's sleep. Sometime after midnight, I woke to a faint noise. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, but as I lay there, straining to listen, the sound became clearer, the soft creak of floorboards, followed by the faintest scrape of metal against wood. Someone was at my door. I sat up slowly, my heart pounding. The doorknob jiggled once, then again, harder this time. "Aiko," I called out, my voice trembling. The rattling stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a soft knock. "Are you okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. No response. I crept to the door, my bare feet silent on the cold floor, pressing my ear against the wood. I listened, every muscle in my body tensed. And then I heard her voice, low and almost melodic. "I just want to talk," she whispered. I backed away from the door, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My phone was on the nightstand, and I grabbed it, my fingers fumbling to unlock the screen. The doorknob rattled again, this time with more force. The sound of her nails scraping against the wood made my skin crawl. "Aiko, stop," I shouted, my voice cracking. The rattling ceased, and for a moment, I thought she might have gone. But then I heard it, the soft pad of her footsteps retreating down the hall. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I confronted her in the kitchen. "Why were you at my door last night?" I demanded, my voice shaking with a mix of fear and anger. She looked up from her cup of tea, her expression blank. "I wasn't," she said simply. "Yes, you were. I heard you." She tilted her head, her dark eyes studying me intently. "You must have been dreaming," she said, her tone calm but unsettling. I knew then that I couldn't stay. Over the next 2 days, I packed my belongings, avoiding Aiko as much as possible. She didn't try to speak to me again, but her presence lingered, a shadow that seemed to follow me wherever I went. On the morning I moved out, she appeared in the hallway as I carried my last box to the car. "Leaving?" she asked, her voice devoid of emotion. "Yeah," I said, not meeting her eyes. "Why?" I hesitated, my grip tightening on the box. "I just found a better place," I said finally. She didn't respond, just stood there, watching me as I walked out the door. I never saw her again. For weeks, I couldn't shake the memory of her face, the way her eyes seemed to follow me even when she wasn't there. Every shadow, every faint sound made my heart race. I told myself I had imagined it, that she was just an odd, socially awkward girl who didn't know how to connect with others. But deep down, I knew better. What did she want? Why did she act the way she did? I'll never know. Have you ever had a roommate who made you question your safety? What would you have done in my place? Story: The Marked Graves. A crisp breeze rustled the leaves as Mark and Sarah trudged through a secluded section of the Appalachian Trail. For them, the wilderness was supposed to be an escape, a place where the hum of civilization faded and the natural world took over. But the forest has secrets, and not all of them are beautiful. As they rounded a bend, Sarah stopped abruptly, pointing off the trail. "What's that?" she whispered, her voice tight. Mark followed her gaze. Hanging from a branch about 20 yards away was something red, a piece of fabric swaying gently in the wind. Curiosity and unease warred within them, but they decided to investigate. The red fabric turned out to be a shirt, tied deliberately to a tree. Beneath it, the earth was freshly disturbed, the dirt loose and uneven. Two mounds, side by side, marked what looked unmistakably like shallow graves. Panic clawed at their throats as they realized the implications. What were they looking at? Who had done this? And most chilling of all, was someone still watching them? The forest no longer felt serene. It felt like a trap. What would you do if you stumbled upon something you were never meant to find? Mark had always been the adventurous one. He loved the feeling of losing himself in the wilderness, where time slowed, and every step felt like a rediscovery of the natural world. Sarah, his best friend since college, shared his love of the outdoors, though she often teased him about his tendency to overplan their trips. "This is why we carry a map," she said that morning as they checked their route. "Getting lost isn't part of the adventure." Mark. But they weren't lost. Not yet. The trail ahead was clear, the map pristine. It was the third day of their week-long hike through the Glastonbury section of the Appalachian Trail, and so far, it had been everything they'd hoped for: peaceful, challenging, and utterly beautiful. By early afternoon, the sun had started to dip behind thick clouds, casting long shadows across the path. The air was cooler here, and the dense trees muffled even the sound of their boots crunching the dirt. It was then that Sarah spotted the red fabric. "What is that doing out here?" Sarah asked, narrowing her eyes. Mark squinted. Probably just someone's shirt. Maybe they left it behind. But even as he said it, something about the way the shirt was tied to the branch felt intentional. It wasn't draped casually like trash or caught by accident. It was knotted. A deliberate act. "We should check it out," Sarah said, though her voice betrayed her hesitation. Mark nodded. His curiosity piqued. He stepped off the trail first, Sarah following close behind. The ground was uneven, the air heavier somehow as they ventured into the trees. When they reached the shirt, Mark's stomach sank. Beneath it, the ground was visibly disturbed. Two oblong mounds of earth rose from the forest floor, their edges still soft and loose. "Mark," Sarah's voice cracked, "those look like graves." The realization hit them like a physical blow. Mark dropped his pack, crouching near one of the mounds for a closer look. "It's fresh," he said, his voice hollow. "The dirt hasn't even settled." Sarah took a step back, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "We need to leave. Right now." Mark stood, his mind racing. "We can't just ignore this. Someone needs to know." "Fine," Sarah said, her voice rising. "We'll report it when we get back to town. But staying here? That's not an option." Her fear was infectious. The once inviting forest now felt oppressive. The shadows deeper, the silence heavier. The thought that someone might be nearby, that they might have stumbled onto something they weren't supposed to see, was too much to bear. Back on the trail, they picked up their pace, glancing over their shoulders every few minutes. Mark kept replaying the scene in his mind: the red shirt, the graves, the eerie quiet of the woods. "What do you think it was?" Sarah asked, breaking the silence. Mark shook his head. "I don't know. Maybe hunters? Or," he trailed off, unwilling to voice his darker thoughts, "or someone burying bodies." Sarah finished for him. Neither of them spoke after that. As the sun dipped lower, their anxiety only grew. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig set their nerves on edge. The forest felt alive in a way it hadn't before, as though it were watching them, waiting for them to let their guard down. At one point, Mark thought he saw movement in the trees, a flicker of motion just beyond his peripheral vision. He froze, straining his ears for any sound, but there was nothing. "You okay?" Sarah asked, noticing his hesitation. "Yeah," he lied. "Just thought I saw something." But he couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The air grew colder as night fell, and they decided to make camp earlier than planned. Neither of them wanted to risk hiking in the dark, not after what they'd seen. Their campsite was quiet, but the sense of unease lingered. Mark kept the fire going. its flickering light casting long shadows that danced ominously against the trees. "Do you think we should have stayed to look closer?" he asked, breaking the silence. Sarah shot him a sharp look. "Are you serious? After what we saw?" "I just mean, what if there's evidence? Something the police could use?" She shook her head. "Mark, there's no way we're going back. What if whoever did it was watching us?" The thought sent a chill down his spine. She was right. The graves were fresh. The red shirt too deliberate. Someone had been there recently, maybe even still was. Neither of them slept well. Every noise outside the tent felt amplified. The hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves, the snap of a branch. Mark clutched the handle of his survival knife, though he doubted it would be much use if something or someone found them. At one point, Sarah whispered, "Do you hear that?" Mark held his breath, straining to listen. At first, there was nothing but the sound of the wind, but then, faint and distant, he heard it, a low, rhythmic sound, like footsteps crunching on dry leaves. He sat up, heart pounding. The footsteps stopped. "Probably just an animal," he whispered, trying to convince himself as much as her. But deep down, he wasn't so sure. At first light, they packed up and resumed their hike. The unease from the previous day lingered, but the thought of getting back to civilization spurred them on. When they reached the nearest town, they found a payphone and reported their discovery to the local authorities. The dispatcher took their information, promising to send someone to investigate. Mark and Sarah exchanged uneasy glances as they hung up. Neither of them felt relieved. Days later, Mark couldn't resist calling the station to follow up. The officer he spoke to was curt, almost dismissive. "We didn't find anything," the officer said. "Probably just animal activity." Mark's stomach churned. "What about the shirt? The graves?" "Nothing there," the officer repeated, his tone final. Mark hung up, feeling a mix of frustration and disbelief. The graves had been real. He knew what they'd seen. But now, they were gone. Years later, Mark still couldn't shake the memory of that day. The red shirt, the disturbed earth, the eerie silence of the forest, it haunted him. What had they stumbled upon? Who had been responsible? And perhaps most chillingly, were the graves really empty when the police arrived? Or had someone returned to hide the evidence? The forest keeps its secrets well, but some things refuse to be forgotten. Story, the missing son. It began like so many other cases, an unexpected phone call on a dreary Monday morning. Rain trickled down the windows of Andrew's small office, its rhythm a faint background to the quiet hum of his computer. He had been going through paperwork, the usual drudgery of an investigator's life. When the call came through, her voice was what struck him first, trembling, almost fractured, as if it were held together by nothing but sheer desperation. "My son is missing." Andrew leaned back in his chair, his instincts sharpening. Missing persons cases were tricky. Often, they ended up being something mundane, a misunderstanding, someone intentionally avoiding contact, or a young adult striking out on their own. But as the woman spoke, he realized this was different. "He's been gone for almost a year," she said, her voice cracking. "At first, he texted me, just short messages every now and then. But now, it's been months, and I don't think it's him. I don't know what to believe anymore." "What makes you think it isn't him?" Andrew asked, already scribbling notes. There was silence on the other end, just the faint sound of her breathing. "A mother knows," she finally whispered. Andrew had heard similar sentiments before, but something about her conviction gave him pause. After she provided the details, her son Jacob, 26 years old, last seen in a nearby town, Andrew agreed to take the case. Jacob's story was one Andrew had seen too many times. A promising young man, bright and kind, had started spiraling in his early 20s. A string of bad choices, dropping out of college, falling in with the wrong crowd, and eventually dabbling in drugs. It wasn't uncommon. What set this case apart was the bizarre communication after his disappearance. For months after Jacob vanished, his mother received a text, "I'm okay. Don't worry about me. I need space." The message didn't alarm her initially. Jacob had always been impulsive, and she thought he might simply be trying to figure things out. But as weeks turned into months, The messages became colder, less like the son she knew. When she called the number, he never answered. I tried so hard to believe it was him, she told Andrew when they met in person. Her hands trembled as she handed him Jacob's photograph. But something about it just felt wrong. Andrew studied the photo. Jacob had an easy smile and intelligent eyes, a kid who seemed like he had everything ahead of him. But there was a weariness there too, something that suggested life had already taken its toll. The first step was retracing Jacob's last known movements. According to his mother, the police had done little beyond filing a report. His phone had last pinged near a small pub on the outskirts of town, a place notorious for attracting the worst kinds of people. Andrew decided that was where he'd start. The pub wasn't hard to find. Nestled in a decaying part of town, it sat at the edge of a poorly lit street, its flickering neon sign barely illuminating the cracked pavement. Even from the outside, Andrew could feel the weight of the place, the kind of establishment that swallowed people whole. Inside, the air was thick with cigarette smoke, the faint stench of stale beer lingering underneath. The dim lighting cast shadows that made it difficult to see faces clearly, and the quiet hum of conversation seemed to stop the moment Andrew stepped through the door. He approached the bar, trying to appear nonchalant. The bartender, a woman in her late 40s with tired eyes, looked him up and down. "Lemonade," Andrew said, forcing a smile. Her eyebrow arched, but she poured the drink without a word. Andrew slid Jacob's photograph across the counter. "Ever seen him?" She froze for just a second, so brief most wouldn't have noticed. Her eyes flicked to the photo, then back to Andrew. "Can't say I have," she said, her tone curt. Andrew leaned in slightly, keeping his voice low. "He was here around the time he disappeared. I'm not looking for trouble, just answers." The bartender hesitated, then nodded toward a group of men sitting at the back table. They might know something. Andrew's gaze followed hers. 5 men sat around a scratched wooden table, their laughter too loud, their stares too sharp. They were an odd mix, some dressed casually, others in expensive designer clothing that seemed out of place in such a dingy pub. He approached cautiously, holding the photo in his hand. "Excuse me," he said, his tone measured. "I'm looking for someone. He might have been here." The laughter stopped. The men turned to him, their expressions unreadable. One of them, a shorter man with salt and pepper hair and a worn leather jacket, smirked. "We see a lot of people come through here. What makes you think we'd remember your guy?" Andrew held up the photo. "He's been missing for almost a year. I'm just trying to help his family." The man leaned back in his chair, studying the photograph. Then he shrugged. "Can't help you." The others muttered their agreement, and Andrew knew pushing further would only paint a target on his back. He thanked them and retreated to the bar, but he could feel their eyes on him the entire time. Over the next few weeks, Andrew spent hours at the pub, blending into the background. He watched the group of men, noting their routines and interactions. One man in particular stood out, the shorter one, who always seemed to be juggling multiple phones. Andrew noticed that one of the phones was a flip phone, old and outdated. It didn't match the image of a man who wore high-end designer clothes. Something about it nagged at him. One evening, he decided to test his theory. Sitting in a corner booth, he dialed Jacob's number. His heart pounded as the line rang. Across the room, the short man reached into his pocket, pulled out the flip phone, and glanced at the screen. Andrew ended the call. The man frowned, then slipped the phone back into his pocket. It was Jacob's phone. Andrew was sure of it. But why was this man carrying it? He tried again, and the pattern repeated. The man silenced the call and pocketed the phone. Andrew's mind raced. If they had Jacob's phone, what else did they have? The thought that Jacob might have met a grim fate was no longer just a possibility. It was a likelihood. Andrew knew he couldn't confront the men directly. They were dangerous, and the pub felt like their stronghold. Instead, he decided to use a different approach. He befriended one of the pub's regulars, a woman named Lisa who seemed to know everyone. Over drinks one night, Lisa confided that the men in the corner weren't just locals. They were part of a drug ring that operated out of the pub. They controlled the area, and anyone who crossed them often disappeared. "They've done it before," she whispered. "I don't know details, but people talk." Andrew's stomach churned. Lisa also mentioned that Jacob had been seen arguing with one of the men shortly before his disappearance. The argument had gotten heated, but no one intervened. It all clicked into place. Jacob had likely owed them money or had gotten involved in something he couldn't escape. Whatever had happened that night in the pub had sealed his fate. Armed with what he'd uncovered, Andrew went to the authorities. He laid out the evidence, the phone, the testimonies, the suspicions, but the response was tepid at best. Without hard evidence, no body, no proof of violence, the police were reluctant to act. Andrew left their office feeling defeated. He had come so close to uncovering the truth, only to have it slip through his fingers. When he met with Jacob's mother to deliver the news, her devastation was palpable. "Do you think he's—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Andrew hesitated. "I don't know, but I think those men know more than they're saying." Her tears were silent, her grief too deep for words. The case stayed with Andrew long after he closed it. He couldn't shake the image of Jacob's phone in that man's hand, or the haunting emptiness in the mother's eyes. In his quiet moments, he wondered, what had really happened to Jacob? Was he still out there somewhere, trapped and unable to escape? Or had the pub claimed another victim, leaving nothing but unanswered questions behind? The truth, he realized, might never be known. Story: The Night Attack. The Appalachian Trail is a place where isolation is a feature, not a flaw, a vast expanse of wilderness where you can leave the world behind. But what happens when the solitude you seek becomes your worst nightmare? The night was calm. The stars scattered across the sky like flecks of silver, and the dense trees whispered in the wind. Mark and his two hiking companions, Emma and Ryan, were ready to settle in at a rustic trail shelter after a grueling day. The serenity of the wilderness, however, was shattered by a sudden argument echoing from the shelter ahead. A couple stood in the flickering light of a lantern, their voices rising in frustration. The woman, her face pale with fury, grabbed her pack and stormed off into the darkness, her flashlight bobbing as she disappeared down the trail. Hours later, a scream tore through the stillness of the night. It wasn't the cry of an animal or the wind twisting through the trees. It was human, a sound so raw and terrified that it made their blood run cold. What would you do if the safety of the forest was replaced with the certainty of a predator? Who or what was lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike? Mark, Emma, and Ryan had been hiking the Appalachian Trail for 5 days, working their way through rugged sections in Tennessee. Exhausted, they reached the shelter just as dusk began to settle. It was a simple structure, 3 walls, a roof, and a raised sleeping platform made of rough wood. A fire pit stood outside, its embers still warm from the last group of hikers. The couple was already there when they arrived. The man, tall and broad-shouldered, wore a scowl as he leaned against the shelter wall. The woman, with a tangle of auburn hair and a deep frown, was pacing. Mark offered a polite nod, trying to break the tension. "Mind if we share the shelter?" "Sure," the man said, though his tone lacked any real warmth. Emma and Ryan exchanged uneasy glances as they set up their gear. The couple's argument was low and tense at first, but as the minutes ticked by, their voices grew louder. "You never listen to me," the woman snapped, her voice carrying in the quiet night. "And you're being ridiculous," the man shot back. Mark cleared his throat. "Everything okay over there?" The woman spun on her heel, grabbing her pack. "I'm done with this. I don't need you telling me what to do." Her companion stepped forward, his tone softer now. "Come on, Sarah, don't be like this." But Sarah was already storming away, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. "I'll hike alone if I have to." The group watched in stunned silence as Sarah disappeared down the trail. Her boyfriend, if that's what he was, stood frozen, his hands clenched into fists. "Shouldn't you go after her?" Emma asked. The man shook his head. "She'll come back when she cools off." Mark frowned. "The trail's dangerous at night. You sure she's okay out there?" "She'll be fine," the man muttered, retreating to his corner of the shelter. The unease in the air was palpable. The group tried to settle in for the night, but sleep didn't come easily. Every sound outside, the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, felt amplified. It was sometime after midnight when the scream shattered the stillness. Mark bolted upright, his heart pounding. Emma and Ryan were already scrambling out of their sleeping bags, their faces pale in the moonlight. What the hell was that? Ryan whispered. Another scream followed, this one closer. It was high-pitched and desperate, the sound of someone in agony. It's her, Emma said, grabbing a flashlight. We have to help her. Without hesitation, the three of them raced down the trail, the beam of their flashlights bouncing wildly. The sound of their breathing filled the silence between Sarah's cries, which grew louder as they approached. They found her lying just off the path, her leg bent at an unnatural angle. Sarah's face was contorted in pain, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Help me," she gasped, clutching at Mark's arm as he knelt beside her. Emma inspected her leg, wincing at the sight. "It's broken. We need to get her back to the shelter." But Sarah grabbed Mark's shirt, her grip surprisingly strong. "He's still out there," she whispered. Mark froze. "Who?" Her eyes darted toward the darkness. "The man who attacked me. He came out of nowhere, hit me with something, then ran." The group wasted no time. Mark and Ryan fashioned a makeshift stretcher from a tarp and some branches, while Emma kept watch, her flashlight sweeping through the trees. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound felt like a potential threat. Mark's mind raced. Who was out there? Was it a random attacker? Or had Sarah's argument with her boyfriend escalated into something more sinister? As they carried Sarah back to the shelter, her fear was contagious. "Do you think he's following us?" Emma whispered. Ryan shook his head, but his grip on the stretcher tightened. "I don't know. Just keep moving." The weight of Sarah's body, combined with the tension of the situation, made the hike feel endless. Mark kept glancing over his shoulder, expecting to see a figure emerge from the darkness. When they finally reached the shelter, Sarah's boyfriend was gone. His pack was still there, but he was nowhere to be found. Emma's voice trembled. "Do you think he—" "I don't know." Mark cut her off. "But we can't worry about him right now. We need to focus on Sarah." They laid her on the sleeping platform and wrapped her leg as best they could. Emma and Ryan took turns keeping watch while Mark tended to Sarah, who drifted in and out of consciousness. But the night didn't bring relief. At one point, Emma swore she saw movement in the trees, a shadow slipping between the trunks. Mark grabbed a hatchet from his pack, his knuckles white as he gripped the handle. "If someone's out there," he said, his voice low, "they're not getting in here without a fight." The hours dragged on, every minute steeped in tension. Mark's mind replayed Sarah's words. He came out of nowhere. Who was he? A fellow hiker? A predator stalking the trail? The possibilities were endless, and each one was worse than the last. As dawn finally broke, the first rays of sunlight cutting through the trees, the group felt a tentative sense of relief. But their ordeal wasn't over yet. They still had to get Sarah to safety, and the attacker could still be out there. Using the stretcher, they began the slow trek back to civilization. The trail felt different in the daylight, but the fear lingered. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig set their nerves on edge. Sarah remained quiet, her eyes darting nervously at every sound. "We'll get you out of here," Mark promised, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. They eventually reached a ranger station, where Sarah was taken to a hospital. The rangers promised to investigate the attack, but days turned into weeks with no leads. Sarah's boyfriend never returned to claim his belongings, and no other hikers reported seeing him. For Mark, Emma, and Ryan, the experience left a scar. The wilderness, once a place of peace and adventure, now felt like a trap, a place where shadows hid predators and safety was never guaranteed. And for Sarah, the question remained, was her attacker human, or something else entirely? What would you do if the darkness of the forest came alive and turned against you? Story, The Night Stalker. They say your home is your sanctuary, the one place where you're supposed to feel safe. But what happens when the walls meant to protect you become your prison, trapping you with something or someone who means you harm? That night started like any other. I was curled up on the couch, a steaming mug of tea in my hands, and an old horror movie playing softly on the TV. The rain outside tapped against the windows, creating a soothing rhythm that made me feel cocooned in my little house at the edge of town. But then I heard it. Tap, tap, tap. At first, I thought it was the rain, the kind of noise you brush off without a second thought. But the tapping grew louder, more deliberate. I muted the TV, straining to listen. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was coming from the living room window. My chest tightened as I slowly turned my head toward the glass. What would you do if someone was standing outside your window in the dead of night, watching you? The moment I saw the shadow, my breath caught in my throat. The figure outside the window was tall and still, shrouded in darkness except for the faint outline illuminated by the porch light. "Hello?" I called out hesitantly, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move. I froze, clutching my mug as if it could somehow shield me. My house was a cozy little place on the outskirts of a sleepy town, surrounded by thick woods. It was perfect for peace and quiet. But now, that isolation felt suffocating. "Can I help you?" I tried again, louder this time. Nothing. The figure finally shifted, and I caught a glimpse of something pale. His face? The porch light flickered, casting strange shadows across the room. I couldn't make out any details, just the unsettling certainty that someone was there. My heart pounded as I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. The dispatcher's calm voice did little to ease my panic. "Stay on the line," she said. "Officers are on their way." "Is the door locked?" "Yes," I whispered, my eyes darting between the window and the front door. "Good. Stay where you are." The minutes stretched on endlessly. The figure remained outside, unmoving, a silent sentinel in the rain. I thought about turning off the lights, but something about the idea of sitting in total darkness made my skin crawl. Then, just as the sound of sirens echoed in the distance, the figure stepped back, slowly, deliberately. He melted into the shadows of the yard, disappearing into the woods. By the time the police arrived, there was no sign of him. They searched the property, their flashlights slicing through the dark, but found nothing. "Probably just a prank," one of the officers said, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't convinced. The rest of the evening was a blur. The officers assured me they'd patrol the area and advised me to call again if anything seemed off. I nodded numbly, locking the door behind them as they left. Despite their reassurances, sleep was impossible. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind sent me bolt upright, my ears straining for any hint of danger. By the time the sun rose, I felt like a ghost of myself, but the daylight brought a fragile sense of safety. I convinced myself it was over, just a random stranger passing through. But as night fell again, the unease returned. This time, the knocking started at the front door. It was soft at first, almost polite, but it quickly escalated. Thud, thud, thud. I crept to the door, my heart hammering so loudly I could barely hear over it. Peering through the peephole, I saw nothing. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling. No response. Then, just as I was about to step away, the knocking stopped and a low, muffled laugh came from the other side of the door. Terrified, I called the police again. This time, the officers arrived quickly, their presence a small comfort in the suffocating darkness. They searched the yard and the surrounding woods but found no sign of the intruder. "He must have run off," one officer said, his tone attempting reassurance. "If he comes back, call us immediately." I nodded, though my hands wouldn't stop shaking. After they left, I double-checked every lock in the house, even propping a chair under the doorknob for extra security. Hours passed without incident, and I started to believe the worst was over. But as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I heard it again, this time from the basement. A faint creak echoed through the house, followed by the unmistakable sound of the basement door slowly opening. My breath caught as I sat up, straining to listen. The door was old, its hinges prone to groaning loudly, but I hadn't opened it in days, and I was certain I'd locked it. Swinging my legs off the bed, I grabbed the baseball bat I kept by my nightstand and tiptoed into the hallway. The basement door was ajar, a sliver of darkness spilling into the hall. My hand trembled as I reached for the light switch, flipping it on. The stairs leading down were empty, the dim bulb casting eerie shadows on the concrete walls below. But just as I was about to close the door, a voice drifted up from the darkness. "You're finally home." I slammed the door shut, shoving the bolt into place with shaking hands. My heart raced as I backed away, my mind struggling to process what I just heard. Before I could react, the doorknob rattled violently, as though someone was trying to force it open. "Who are you?" I screamed, clutching the bat tightly. No response, just the relentless sound of the doorknob turning. Panicking, I ran back to my bedroom and locked the door. My hands fumbled with my phone as I dialed 911 for the third time that night. "He's inside the house," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Please, hurry." The dispatcher's calm instructions barely registered as I pressed my back against the door, listening to the chaos outside. Footsteps echoed through the house, heavy and deliberate, moving closer to my room. Then came the knocking. The sound was slow, methodical, each knock sending a jolt of fear through my body. "Let me in," the voice said, low and rasping. Tears streamed down my face as I gripped the bat, every muscle in my body screaming for escape. But there was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. The door rattled violently, the wood splintering under the force. I screamed, backing into the corner of the room, bracing myself for the worst. Just as the door began to give way, red and blue lights flashed outside the window. The sound of sirens filled the air, followed by the heavy thud of footsteps on the porch. The intruder's movements stopped abruptly. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the footsteps retreated, fading into the distance. When the police burst into the house moments later, the intruder was gone. The officers searched the property thoroughly, but there was no sign of the man. No footprints, no evidence of forced entry, nothing to prove he'd ever been there. "Are you sure you saw someone?" one officer asked gently. "Yes," I insisted, my voice shaky. "He was here. He tried to get into my room." They didn't doubt me outright, but their skeptical glances said enough. To them, it was just another late-night scare, a figment of an overactive imagination. But I knew the truth. I stayed with my sister for the next few weeks, too afraid to return home, even in the safety of her house. I couldn't sleep, my mind replaying the events over and over. When I finally returned to my own home, it didn't feel like mine anymore. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow cast by the trees outside filled me with dread. I never saw the intruder again, but his presence lingered, an invisible weight that turned my sanctuary into a place of unease. They never found him. To this day, I don't know who he was or why he chose my house. Was it random? Or had he been watching me for weeks, waiting for the perfect moment? The thought keeps me up at night, my mind spinning with questions that will never be answered. Have you ever had an experience that made you question how safe you really are, even in your own home? Story, the rest stop chase. The long stretches of highway were endless, dark ribbons cutting through the barren desert. My dad and I had been driving for hours, the hum of the car engine a monotonous backdrop to our journey. We were heading west, crossing state lines to visit my grandmother, who lived in a remote little town miles from any major city. The plan was simple: drive until we couldn't anymore, stop for a break, and then keep going. It wasn't the first road trip we'd taken together, and it felt like just another leg of the journey. As the clock crept past midnight, fatigue began to weigh on us. "We'll pull over at the next rest stop," Dad said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. When we finally saw the small blue sign marking the rest area, it was like a beacon of relief. We pulled into the lot, which was sparsely dotted with a few other cars. A single flickering streetlight illuminated part of the cracked pavement, casting eerie shadows. It seemed peaceful enough. "I'll stretch my legs, then we'll rest here for a bit," Dad said, stepping out into the cool night air. I followed, pulling my hoodie tighter against the biting wind. But then, just as we began to relax, the truck appeared. It was parked at the far end of the lot, shrouded in darkness. We hadn't noticed it when we pulled in, but its engine roared to life as we exited the car. I glanced toward it, instinctively uneasy. The truck's headlights clicked on, cutting through the night like two blinding eyes. At first, I thought it was just another traveler. Maybe the driver had been resting like us, getting ready to hit the road again. But something about the way the truck moved made my stomach churn. It didn't drive toward the highway. Instead, it crept forward, its tires crunching slowly over the gravel, heading directly toward us. "Dad," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I see it," he replied, his eyes narrowing. The truck stopped a few spaces away, its engine idling. The windows were tinted, concealing the driver, but I could feel the weight of their gaze. "Let's get back in the car," Dad said, his tone firm but calm. Back inside the safety of our vehicle, we locked the doors and sat in tense silence. The truck remained where it was, its headlights beaming directly at us. "Probably nothing," Dad muttered, more to himself than to me. "Could just be a coincidence." But neither of us believed that. Minutes passed, each one stretching longer than the last. The truck didn't move, didn't turn off its lights, didn't do anything except sit there like a predator watching its prey. Finally, Dad shifted the car into gear. "Let's get out of here," he said. As we pulled toward the exit, the truck suddenly lurched forward. It swung out of its space and followed us, its engine roaring like an animal in pursuit. "Why is he following us?" I asked, panic creeping into my voice. Dad didn't answer, his focus locked on the road ahead. The truck's headlights loomed in the rearview mirror, growing closer with every second. We merged onto the highway, hoping the truck would veer off or pass us. But it didn't. Instead, it sped up, tailing us so closely I could almost feel its presence pressing against the back of our car. "Is he trying to run us off the road?" I asked, gripping the edge of my seat. "Not if I can help it," Dad said, his voice tense but steady. He pressed down on the gas, and the car surged forward, the engine straining against the sudden demand for speed. The truck matched our pace, its high beams flooding the interior of our car with harsh, white light. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, its lanes empty except for us and the truck. The darkness of the surrounding desert felt oppressive, a void that offered no refuge. "Hold on," Dad warned as he took a sharp exit onto a narrow side road. The tires screeched as we rounded the curve, the truck close behind. The road was rough, unpaved in places, and every bump sent jolts through the car. "Can't we call the police?" I asked, fumbling for my phone. "No signal out here," Dad said. "We'll have to lose him ourselves." He veered onto another road, this one even narrower and lined with jagged rocks. The truck followed, its engine roaring louder as it closed the gap between us. I could see the silhouette of the driver now, a dark figure behind the wheel. He wasn't trying to hide anymore. His intent was clear. "Turn off the lights," Dad said suddenly. "What?" "Do it. Trust me." I reached over and flicked off the headlights. The world plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the moon and stars above. Dad slowed the car, pulling off to the side of the road and cutting the engine. We sat in silence, holding our breath as the truck barreled past us, its headlights slicing through the night. For a moment, I thought it was over, but then the truck's brake lights flared, and it screeched to a stop. "He's turning around," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Not if we're gone first," Dad said. He restarted the car, keeping the lights off as he drove down the road, navigating by moonlight. The truck's headlights reappeared in the distance, sweeping back and forth as the driver searched for us. We took turn after turn, weaving through the labyrinth of dirt roads. Each time we thought we'd lost him, the truck's lights would reappear, relentless and unyielding. Finally, the road opened up onto a small clearing. In the distance, I could see the faint glow of a town, civilization. "There," I said, pointing. Dad floored the gas, the car jolting forward as we sped toward the lights. The truck was close behind, its engine roaring like a beast closing in for the kill. As we neared the edge of town, the truck began to fall back. Its headlights dimmed, and it finally turned off, disappearing into the darkness. We didn't stop until we reached the safety of a brightly lit Walmart parking lot. We sat in the car, the fluorescent lights above casting a cold glow over everything. My hands were still trembling, my heart racing as I tried to process what had just happened. "What was that?" I asked, my voice shaky. "I don't know," Dad said, his own hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. "But we're not stopping at any more rest stops tonight." We stayed there for an hour, too afraid to leave, even surrounded by other cars and the bustle of late-night shoppers. I couldn't shake the feeling that the truck was still out there, waiting for us. To this day, I don't know who was driving that truck or why they targeted us. Maybe it was just a cruel prank, or maybe their intentions were far darker. What I do know is that the memory of that night has never left me. Every time I see a truck on a dark road, I feel that same spike of fear, the same rush of adrenaline that carried us through those harrowing moments. What would you have done in our place? Could you have stayed calm, or would the fear have consumed you? Story: The Staring Roommate. Moving to Toronto felt like a fresh start, a chance to step outside my comfort zone. I'd taken a gap year to improve my English and immerse myself in a different culture before finishing business school. Everything about the city felt vibrant and alive. The towering skyscrapers, the bustling streets, the endless rhythm of life. The apartment was nothing special, but it was affordable and close to my language school. A 3-bedroom shared unit. It came with one roommate already in place, Sandro, a Swiss-German giant with an infectious laugh and a love for cooking. We hit it off immediately, bonding over our shared experiences as international students. For weeks, the 3rd bedroom remained empty, its vacancy a strange void in the apartment. Sandro joked about the mystery tenant who would eventually arrive, imagining all kinds of strange characters. I laughed along, but part of me hoped for someone quiet, someone who wouldn't disrupt the easy balance we'd found. When Sandro left for a week-long road trip, I didn't think much of it. I figured I'd enjoy the solitude, maybe binge a few shows or explore the city on my own. What I didn't realize was that my life was about to take a very unsettling turn. The day the new tenant arrived was like any other. I went to my morning classes, grabbed lunch at a small cafe, and returned home in the afternoon. By 3 p.m., I expected them to show up, but the hours dragged on with no sign of anyone. By nightfall, I'd convinced myself they weren't coming. I made dinner, watched some Netflix, and finally went to bed around midnight. A soft knock at my bedroom door jolted me awake. Groggy and disoriented, I stumbled to the door. Standing there was a young Japanese woman, petite and quiet, with a suitcase by her side. She introduced herself with a shy smile and halting English, explaining that her flight had been delayed. We exchanged pleasantries, and I showed her around the apartment. She seemed polite but distant, keeping her answers brief and avoiding eye contact. I figured she was just tired from her journey. The encounter was so uneventful that I didn't give it another thought. But looking back, there was something about her demeanor, a subtle unease that should have set off alarms. The first few days with her as my roommate were unremarkable. She stayed in her room most of the time, only emerging to cook or use the bathroom. Occasionally, she asked me for help navigating the city, how to use the subway, where to find the nearest grocery store. I didn't mind helping. In fact, I felt a little sorry for her. But then, things started to change. It began with the staring. One evening, I was lying on my bed, scrolling through my phone, when I glanced toward the window. The shared balcony connected all the rooms in the apartment, and I'd left the blinds partially open. There she was, standing outside, her figure illuminated by the soft glow of the streetlights. She wasn't looking at the skyline or the view. She was looking at me. I froze, unsure of how to react. Was she just lost in thought? Did she even realize I could see her? I waved hesitantly, hoping to break the awkwardness. She didn't wave back. Instead, she turned abruptly and walked back into her room. I laughed it off, telling myself it was nothing, but the unease lingered. The staring became a nightly occurrence. Every evening, like clockwork, I'd glance toward the window to find her on the balcony, her gaze fixed on me. It didn't matter if the blinds were open or closed. She always seemed to know when I was there. At first, I tried to ignore it, but as the nights went on, her presence felt more invasive, more deliberate. One evening, she knocked on my door to ask about the washing machine. It was the 3rd time she'd asked, despite me explaining it in detail before. Her questions were odd, overly specific, and her tone flat, almost mechanical. "Why don't we hang out?" she said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. The abrupt shift caught me off guard. I stammered something about being busy and quickly retreated to my room, locking the door behind me. That night, I closed the blinds completely, hoping to block her out. But around midnight, I heard the faint sound of footsteps on the balcony. My stomach knotted as I realized she was out there again, standing in the darkness, staring. I didn't look. I couldn't. The breaking point came a few nights later. I had spent the day trying to avoid her, keeping to myself and only leaving my room when necessary. By the time evening rolled around, I was on edge, every sound in the apartment setting me on high alert. At around 2 a.m., I was startled awake by a soft knock on my door. "Are you okay?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. The knock came again, louder this time. My heart raced as I stared at the door, the faint glow from the hallway casting shadows beneath it. "Do you need something?" I asked, trying to sound calm. Again, silence. Then, after a long pause, I heard footsteps retreating down the hall. I let out a shaky breath, relief washing over me, until I glanced toward the window. She was there, standing on the balcony, her face pressed close to the glass. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and fixed on me. For a moment, I couldn't move. My mind screamed at me to do something, but my body felt paralyzed. Then she reached for the sliding door handle. I shot out of bed, slamming the lock into place just as she tried to open it. Her face twisted in frustration, and she banged on the glass once, twice, before retreating into the shadows. The next morning, I packed my bags. I didn't care about breaking the lease or losing the security deposit. I just needed to get out. I called Sandro and told him everything. He was shocked, insisting he'd never noticed anything strange about her. "Are you sure you didn't imagine it?" he asked. I wanted to believe that. I wanted to think it was all some misunderstanding, that she was just socially awkward or dealing with culture shock. But the memory of her staring through the glass, her hand on the door handle, told me otherwise. By afternoon, I was gone. Even now, I can't make sense of her behavior. Was it loneliness? Curiosity? Or was there something darker at play? Sometimes, I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't locked the sliding door that night. Would she have simply walked in? Or was her persistence a sign of something far more sinister? I'll never know, and maybe that's for the best. What would you have done in my place? Stayed and confronted her, or left like I did? Thank you for joining us on this eerie journey through chilling tales and soothing rain. If you enjoyed these spine-tingling stories, don't forget to hit the like button, share this video with fellow thrill seekers, and subscribe to Nightmare Rain for more haunting content. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss a night of suspenseful relaxation. Sweet dreams, if you dare.